It's like almost like the races are your workouts. It's like almost like the races become the workouts because you're constantly at peak.
It's like, okay, we shook hands, this is what we're gonna do.
Yeah, they have to get a new, number person.
It's just,
It's
He might
right.
be retiring.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know.
Unless the younger one decides she wants to do it.
Yeah, I was sitting there and this guy got my attention. Turns out we graduated high school together. We were both in high school ran track. I didn't know I kind of knew he lived in the area, but he's the JV soccer coach at Indiana now. He does like IT for the school. He was there. One of his soccer players was running the 100. Also, he's like a really fast kid. I think he qualified.
Is it live?
I don't know. I think he said he got to the qualifying time for state. He was like fourth or fifth in that fast shoot of the 100. I don't know what
I don't remember.
his name was.
And that was up in Savannah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a fast race. The 100. Charlottesville kid, like, won it.
Because you already
Seemed
have.
like everybody was fast.
Yeah.
Because you also know. You all sent out the blue.
Well, yeah, it didn't go to anybody, right?
I saw it.
I
That
only
might be
saw
because
it
I was
because
on
I'm still on
subcommittee.
that hack list.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah, that's about the time.
How you doing?
That lines up.
We have to get it in before she goes to school.
Yeah. I got it
I
after
mean,
my
I got
first year.
it, so it probably went to the hack list. It is a
But I
mess.
think there's like 90
How's it going? Any other comments? 15 minutes before the meeting.
Oh, okay.
I know.
To open.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I did read module 2 mostly. It looks pretty good. There's a lot of pictures.
Oh, you're good. We just got it.
Oh, Richard.
Yeah, like 45 minutes ago.
It was just a picture.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's what it works.
does what he needs to do.
Preservation people needs more pictures. They want me to read it backwards.
He actually, his family's pretty
All right.
much on top of it. It's really
That's
nice
good.
to see. He's a good kid.
Good.
Yeah, he may be late. So, and I know Brian is going to go to the conference.
Hello. Beautiful, thank you. You understand my concern?
Yeah, I think she's. Yeah, totally. It's just going to be two of us.
Spicy day today at work, possibly because of email commitments. Hard to know. These things do seem related in some way.
For hours until I finished.
Yeah?
The Guajiros, I saw you crossing the road.
Okay. There's a Carl sighting.
That's good.
I wanted to yell out the window.
People like to do that. I'll be walking across an intersection and someone will like lay on the horn and yeah, it gives me a heart attack. And it's not someone who wants to like drive through me, no. It's
Well, I wasn't
trying
driving.
to say hello or something.
It comes from love. These are good problems.
What was I doing yesterday that would have been out there?
You were crossing the intersection.
Oh.
Relevance other than the trail. Yeah, right. It's involved in the trail.
Daily march down West Main.
Welcome all. Apologies for the delay here and the echo, 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 echo.
That would be me, I'll fix it.
Test, test. And again. Hey, better, we got it. Welcome all to the Charlottesville City Council and Planning Commission joint work session on zoning updates, modules 2 and also 1 as well. I think we've got some updates from staff about module 2, and then we can dig in.
Yeah. Yep.
Evening, everyone. Just a few meeting logistics before we jump into everything. Make sure to pay attention to your microphone so that we're catching that, though our audience from afar will let us know if there's any concerns with that as we move forward. We will not have any verbal public comment this evening. If the public is interested in commenting during this time frame, we have note cards for those in person, or we will get the comments emailed to me directly. That's for anyone out there. And if they are emailed during this meeting, then we will attach them directly to the minutes. People have been submitting comments concerning the zoning constantly, and that's good. And that's being logged in a different way. And if we get the comments tonight, we will log those as well. But we will also attach those to the minutes for the meeting as we had noted in the instruction. So just want to make that announcement. I'll have them in a minute.
Is that it?
That's it.
All right. Sorry. Okay. Mr. Chair, are we ready? I'm sorry, I didn't catch your.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Patrick, can you put the presentation up? Do we have a Christie joining? All right, great. All right, good evening, Planning Commission, Council. Good to see you this evening. Want to just check in, everybody all set, ready to go? Excellent. All right. So our goal for this evening is just to do an overview of the Module 2, which we got out the door this late this afternoon. There is a recorded presentation as well. This presentation essentially mirrors that, available online, as well as the draft document and executive summary and other documents, as well as everything from Module 1. I'll note right from the get-go that our comment period for this, for both Module 2 and Module 1, reaches out to April 30th. So we're extending the comment period for Module 1 and incorporating Module 2 into that. So April 30th is our new comment deadline. Patrick, slide, please. So again, this is just an overview of the Module 2 portion of the draft zoning ordinance. Slide, please. These are notes for more aimed towards the public. You guys know all of this stuff. It's the same as what we've seen in the past. Go ahead, Patrick. I'm going to actually, Patrick, let's go ahead and skip through a handful of these slides. This is just schedule stuff. Go ahead. Go ahead. All right. So I just wanted to note here at the beginning that we've got ongoing process of taking comments. We particularly have focused on the comments we've received already to date from Planning Commission and City Council, both in your previous meeting jointly and in previous meetings of the Planning Commission. Here are some of the changes that we're already working on. I'll just highlight a couple of these. One, we're doing for the districts both summary images and intent language. As was talked about the last time you met jointly, we're looking at the parking in the front and side yards for 1 and 2 unit dwellings. We're doing additional clarification around the issues of height. I'll also note at this time that with regard to map changes, we're not intending to talk about map changes this evening, but what the staff has been doing is we're collecting every single map change that we get, specific or general. We are sorting through all of those. We're going to do an analysis of every single one over the next 3 weeks or so in preparation for after we get through the module phase of this work. We're going to be consolidating the zoning ordinance into one draft document, which will then come back to you, come back to the public for a review of all of it together. With that will be a new map that will reflect all the changes based on that review that we've done at that point in time. So right now we're going to focus in on text with the map changes to come. Slide, please. All of you guys know what a module is at this point in time, but I'll just note we're focusing here now on Module 2, which includes the development standards. Things like landscaping, parking, signage, and lighting. So it's a big section. There's a lot to go over. Slide, please. So this is just a summary page of all the different sections to Module 2. I'm going to go into each of these at least a little bit so you guys know and have an understanding of what is presented in this section. Slide. And slide, please. So note, in terms of using the development standards section, know that this section of the ordinance refers a lot to outside documents, manuals that we use, that staff use, that the public uses in order to get down to the details of what is required in the city. So these includes the Standards and Design Manual, which is an existing document, Streets That Work, our guidelines for planting and maintenance of trees, and then the new document, which was also released today, is the Affordable Housing Dwelling Unit Ordinance's Implementation Manual. And that beyond what's required within the ordinance, that tells a property owner how they go about submitting their affordability requirements, the details in terms of meeting that requirement, and how that requirement is monitored and tracked for enforcement purposes over time. Slide, please. So the very beginning of Module 2 of the development standards section of the zoning ordinance, there's an applicability page. And this is basically a nice shorthand way of understanding, depending on what nature of development I'm doing, whether it's new construction, an addition, or a facade treatment, what standards then apply to my project, right? Because certain standards only apply at a new construction level, for example, whereas others apply for even a simple project. Is that right? I'm sorry, can you go back to them? Thank you. For each development standard, you'll generally find an intent section, a section that then goes deeper into where that section, what types of project that section applies to, the standards associated with that standard, and then how that standard is measured or implemented. Slide, please. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the development bonuses section. And there's a couple things covered in here, but the key thing that's covered in here is our affordable housing requirements. I want to state right up at the beginning, we are defining affordable housing as housing affordable to somebody a household earning 60% of area median income. So while that's the standard for the purposes of this work, there will be individual programs or policies adopted by the city that will target lower area median incomes. For example, we can imagine in a round of CAF funding being released that the city might choose to target a 50% or even 30% AMI level for that particular round. Or as another example we'll come to, we're proposing additional incentives for developments that hit a 50% of area median income standard. But overall, for the purposes of defining affordable housing, we're using a 60% of area median income standard. For reference, in the last year, that standard meant household income of $62,900 for a four-person household. All right, slide, please. So there's two types of development bonuses included in this section. One is targeting the preservation of existing structures, and the other one is for affordable dwelling units. Slide. The existing structure preservation bonus is intended, and this is something we've talked about a lot, is intended to incentivize preservation of the existing structure. And it does so by requiring that the first 25 feet of the structure be preserved in order to qualify for the bonus. And then the bonus offered is an additional unit of additional residential dwelling unit. We're proposing to apply this standard within the RA and now the RB district as well. Slide. Then the affordable dwelling unit section is at the base level, requires that any project with 10 or more residential units that are located in zoning districts other than residential A, B, or C have at least 10% of their units at 60% of AMI. Slide, please. I'm sure that. So that's noted here. So 10% of dwelling units must be affordable at 60% of AMI or less, or developers must pay a fee in lieu. And the money from the fee in lieu goes directly into the Charlottesville Affordable Housing Fund. Again, I'll note here the manual that I referenced earlier for the Affordable Housing Dwelling Unit Program includes all the standards and how we deal with things like monitoring and enforcement over time. Slide. I'm sorry, I thought there was another slide in here. Could you go back one? It's all right. Well, I'll go ahead and speak to the other thing I want to talk about is in terms of standards, it's not there, but that's okay. Okay. So the other rule that we have is we have an additional density bonus of 2 stories where a development takes the 10% of units that they're required to do and puts it at 50% of AMI. And then the final bonus that we're proposing is that in the residential A, residential B, and residential C districts, a project could double the allowed density if 100% of the project is affordable. That is, the entire project, all units on the site are affordable at 60% of AMI or less.
Would you like us to wait, or do you want questions as you go?
How about quick clarifying questions as we go?
I'll wait.
All right. Go ahead.
James, if you want to flip to slide 19, those bonuses are outlined just below the requirement on that slide.
Go back. That's where they were. Thank you, Christy.
I believe that's
Sure thing.
Christy Dodson from Code Studio on the phone there.
I was about to say,
Thank you.
the voice from above. Thank you, Christy. All right, slide, please. All right, next section of the ordinance talks about blocks. We recognize that in order to enhance walkability, one of the things we can do is create smaller block sizes, right? Create more connectivity, a better street network overall. So this requirement basically says where you exceed a certain size of your lot, you're required to introduce a block pattern. New streets, new connecting streets, so on. Details are in the ordinance, but this requirement applies both where a lot is of a certain size or greater, or where there's a certain length of street frontage. Slide. Streetscapes, again, also meant to encourage and support walkability and also create space for street trees in particular. This requirement introduces a size standard for the amount of space in front of the building that needs to be available for sidewalks and a green verge, if you will, where the street trees and lighting and so on would be located. It's tied back to our street classifications in the Streets at Works plan and identifies the clear walk zone, which is the sidewalk width, and then the greenscape zone, which is the width of space where the trees must be located.
Is that in the right of way, on private property, or either or, depending on how?
Wait till the next slide, Carl.
Either or, depending on, I mean, ultimately what needs to happen is either way, that's the minimum amount of space that needs to be provided.
Okay.
So it's either or. Slide, please. All right, this section, we have 2 sections here. This is in the section dealing with transportation and parking. We've got a detailed set of requirements relative to pedestrian access, ensuring that buildings are always accessible from the street, from the public pedestrian realm to the access to the buildings. And then we have a set of minimum bicycle parking requirements, both at the short term, that's for visitors to a given location, and then long-term storage, which generally targets residential or office uses. All right, similarly for motor vehicles, for cars, we have standards that require safe access to sites. And then significantly, at this point, we are proposing no minimum parking requirement in order to support reuse and redevelopment of sites within the city. We fully anticipate that there'll be a great deal of conversation on this topic. And we look forward to having that. Slide, please. Another important section of the ordinance deals with transitions. This is where we have a higher intensity district next to or abutting a lower intensity district. And these standards then apply in those situations and use space, setbacks, landscaping, and step backs, right? That's where the greater height of the building might step back at a higher point in order to reduce the overall massing in proximity to the lower intensity district. Slide, please. Tree preservation. So we've preserved many of the requirements that exist within our existing ordinance and are beefing those up, if you will, in order to ensure greater opportunities for tree preservation and replacement on sites. In particular, there's the tree cover requirements. These exist within our existing zoning ordinance. One of the things that we're including is the requirement for a tree removal permit. So it makes it very clear that if you're removing a tree over 15 inches in caliper, you are required to get a permit from the city. That allows us and gives us a stronger ability to actually enforce these provisions.
So what is a tree removal permit? I know it's going to be a Module 3 thing.
You're right.
Are we talking council approval or?
Oh, no, no.
NES?
It simply goes to the zoning administrator.
Okay.
But that tree removal permit has to be submitted so that we can ensure that the act of removing that tree doesn't take the site out of compliance with the standards in the zoning ordinance, right?
Gotcha.
We don't have a strong mechanism for doing that today, which means that trees that are on existing sites could come down without our ability to ensure that the standards applying to a given site are still being met.
So would this apply even to a site like that isn't having a development on it? You're just removing an 18-inch caliper tree?
Yes. Yeah, this is not relative to development. This is relative to trees on sites.
This would be each individual tree, not a site.
Each individual tree. Well, I mean, theoretically, if someone's removing 5 trees, they would submit a permit application and indicate on that 5 trees. Slide, please. Finally, this section has our critical slopes provisions. I will note that the requirements are the same as today, but the language is significantly streamlined and easier to follow than today's ordinance. The key difference is that rather than a waiver, which is a somewhat undefined term, we are moving this to a special exemption. Special exemption process will include an actual public hearing, but otherwise will be the same process, Planning Commission to City Council. So for those who are familiar, the waiver process that we have today does not include a public hearing. And that is, as we've said, a high-level overview. If there are any further questions, happy to take them now.
Mr. Mitchell, can you start us off?
Yeah. A couple of questions. The first question relates to the affordability dwelling unit, number 2, the bonus.
Yeah.
What do the developers think of that? I mean, do we have the developers nodding their heads saying we think we can build 100% affordable units on this site? Or is this, I mean, it's just something we're throwing out there?
So the notion of the bonus provided in the RA, RB, and RC that basically says you can double the number of units if 100% of the units on site are affordable. We don't anticipate for-profit, private sector developers taking advantage of that, right? That is really something that the only ones who could take advantage of that would be an affordable housing developer who is seeking a subsidy from some source within the existing range of sources that are out there. It is not on its face financially feasible
So question.
without subsidy.
Question about the critical slope waiver.
Yeah.
So the language is no different really than the language we've got today.
The outcome is no different from
The outcome, that's important.
Right.
Because the outcome is a little different from the language, because the language really focuses on environmental mitigations. And we often have outcomes that take into account socioeconomic advantages of allowing the waiver.
No, let me clarify the statement. The process allows, the process as defined will allow the Planning Commission and City Council to take in all factors when they're weighing the public benefit. So we have defined it as that broad term of public benefit. I forgot the second point I was going to make in there, but I know what it was.
But you've answered the question.
Right, I did. But when I said outcome, I didn't mean necessarily the results. What I meant is it's intended to accomplish the same thing that our existing zoning ordinance is intending to accomplish, but with that caveat that it's the public benefit is the broad conceptualization of public benefit.
And just one general statement. You talk about parking and transportation in the document. The parking that you're talking about is focused on residential parking, and that's important to do. But I'll just remind us, and you guys have heard me say this over and over again, that we want Charlottesville to be a destination, not a place that people drive through. So we need to develop a parking strategy beyond just the residential stuff that allows us to recognize that parking is a driver of our economic enterprise as well.
Yeah, I'm definitely not going to disagree with that. I think, but what I'm going to emphasize in what you said is a parking strategy, right? So just like in our existing scenario, the downtown area does not currently have a minimum parking requirement. Right? That was removed some years ago. But we continue to need to assess parking need and have strategies for meeting that need. And I will always be one to refer back to what does our data say in terms of what we need. The other thing I had meant to note when we got to that slide was we're proposing a transportation demand management requirement as part of the transportation requirement. That requirement gets triggered by, right now we're proposing projects that are at 50,000 square feet or greater. We can notch that up or down as we go through this process of discussing what that is. But the basic idea is that a project over that size will be required to submit to us a transportation demand management plan that we can review, and in order to understand what actions they're taking on site, either physical improvements to the site or programmatic improvements to the site that serve to mitigate the transportation impacts, including parking impacts on surrounding areas, as well as encourage the use of alternative forms of transportation. So examples of that would include, obviously, parking of all types, parking for bicycles, parking for cars, parking for shared scooter systems, shared vehicles, and those types of things. It could also include programmatic things like guaranteed ride home and so on. So there's a wide range of things that could be included in that, but what we're doing there is putting a focus on thinking holistically about transportation systems and how a large-scale development fits within those systems, and how we ensure those sites are maximizing the transportation choice available to residents, tenants, or users of the site.
Yep. Yeah, and I agree with all that. My only reiteration is that our friends in the surrounding counties are developing economic nodes. Mm-hmm. And they're doing that so that their people don't have to drive into Charlottesville. If we make it difficult for them to park when they get into Charlottesville, we're going to start losing business on the downtown mall and in a number of the other Barracks Road and other places like that.
If we don't stay competitive, right? Ultimately, that's a question of competitiveness.
Yeah. And parking is a part of it.
Please.
About the, about the walkability and the size. I
Yep.
think one of the slides you said, you know, the building gets a certain size, then they're gonna have to break it up, you know, to be small.
The block,
The block.
yeah.
So can you give me an example of a project maybe that's been approved the last 10 years that if it had come in under these guidelines that they would be required to break it up? Do we have any examples now?
I think actually one off the top of my head is the 240 Stribling project that was approved last year, which did break up into blocks. So that's one that would not only ever been required to provide it, but then met that requirement in their design. Any redevelopment on the Route 29 corridor, where we have the large, the Kmart site, the Marshall site, those types of properties, each of those would be, were they to come in for redevelopment, would be subject to the set of rules. And
Also,
that's,
the West Main, like the standard and the flats would have hit that.
Probably.
Sure.
And if you can talk a little bit about what went into coming up with the definition for this for affordability.
60% of AMI. I think that, well, I'm going to start by saying that that's been the conversation that I've heard for quite a while, that our target is 60% of AMI. Yeah, thank you. The Affordable Housing Plan also set that target back when it was adopted in March 2021.
And it's a 60% AMI maximum.
Exactly.
The housing plan is at a minimum half of investment going to 0 to 30% AMI.
Yeah.
So it's not saying 60% AMI max is the only thing we're doing and that's good enough.
Absolutely correct. I was trying to emphasize that point when I spoke, but I may not have. The main thing when we say that when we define affordable housing as 60% of AMI, what we're really saying is that 80% of AMI is not. And that's kind of the federal or national standard for affordable housing is 80% of AMI. But what we're saying is the city of Charlottesville is going to be 60% of AMI, but there'll be individual programs or policies that will target even lower numbers, and the Affordable Housing Plan provides us with direction in that regard to target 30% of AMI for a portion of our spending.
Mr. Duranzia,
Sir?
questions on this?
I don't.
Very good. Mr.
I've
Buck.
got one follow-up question, if I
Please.
might ask it. I think you have on the right page. You talk about last page. You talk about trees,
Yes.
and you suggest that we're pretty strapped as relates to being able to regulate and dictate what happens with trees. What incentives? I think I read something someplace else that you were thinking of. What incentives are we going to put out there to kind of like affordable housing? Is there a way we can incent developers to include?
I don't know
trees
that,
in there.
at this point, we haven't included incentives related to trees. We've been focused on what are the requirements, what we can place relative to tree planting, landscaping broadly, open space requirements, and those types of things.
I think that was one of the recommendations from the tree commission that we
Yeah.
at least give some thought to
Right.
incenting,
Yeah.
incentivizing.
And
folks
I'm happy to
trees.
think about it. I do run into the question that where I incentivize, my biggest incentivizing, my best tool for incentivizing anything is density bonuses, which takes up more space.
Right.
Yeah. And unless we're already offering density bonuses relative to affordable housing. But I'm open to other ideas as to what can incentivize trees.
Are there any sticks rather than carrots?
No, and that's what we focus on is the sticks. That while we're limited to a certain degree by the state, we're trying to push the envelope on what we can require, right? So we've got the tree canopy requirement that's dictated to us by the state. But one thing we can do is by putting this tree permit in place, we can ensure that our enforcement is much, much stronger and easier for us and therefore make the whole system more readily enforceable.
Yeah.
Then the other thing we've done is where we can identify a public health, safety, and welfare basis for requiring trees, we're doing that. So in the transition requirements, we've put tree requirements in those transitions. And the streetscape, we've put tree requirements in the streetscape. And there's a third one. What's the third one where we have it?
Well, the spacing for walk space versus greenscaping. So, I mean, that's going to be a requirement, so applicants are going to have to take into account that in the front end more so than it being an afterthought.
I know, the other one was in the parking lots. We have a tree planting requirement in the parking lots. So in each of those places, we can draw a clear connection between public health, safety, and welfare in tree planting, and direct and place a requirement for trees.
And I know those are a number of some pretty big changes. I think particularly the permit process for tree removal. I think I could easily see how that kind of just creates a cultural shift in terms of expectation and staff review. I know in the Tree Commission's report, they talked about how Richmond's tree canopy has been expanding in recent years, which has been a success story because obviously their population's growing, they're seeing more development, yet they've done it. Is that because, do we have a sense, is that happening because they're doing these kind of changes that have been proposed? Are there things above and beyond we haven't incorporated just because they seem like a good case study of like what has been working?
I don't know the specifics of what's happening in Richmond. I'm actually been having some started a conversation with the Richmond planning director. I'm hoping to continue that conversation on a variety of topics. But, I mean, one thing I might speculate is that it would be tied back to the fact that they're in more of a redevelopment. We're in a redevelopment phase. They're in a redevelopment phase. I suspect, though, that we have more greenfield sites that are available and being developed, and they're redeveloping more sites that they can then bring trees onto where they're not currently existing.
Yeah, they certainly
But
have way
that's
more
a little
vacant
bit
lots.
that's a little bit speculative.
Okay, thank you.
I've heard a little bit about this. There's a citizen effort to take care of and plant trees in street tree spaces. There's a lot of empty street tree spaces in Richmond, and just putting trees in them has been effective.
And I think we have a similar effort in that regard, to the credit of the Tree Commission.
Mr. Habab, questions?
Yes, thanks. I had a question. Speaking of the trees, why 15-inch caliper? Where does that? Is that the minimum we can do, or is that like a good number we feel?
I don't know the basis for the number. It was a number that was chosen. I
James, I
imagine
can-
from a reasonable perspective, but there's Christy, voice from above, who knows the answer.
That is currently the threshold for trees. I'll turn on my video so you can see me. That's currently the threshold for if you are taking down those trees, you technically have to submit a site plan. So it's sort of an existing requirement, although I don't know that necessarily it's used in the way that we're anticipating it being used in the tree removal permit. But I think that number is, something that you sort of have as a starting point, but it's certainly up for discussion if you feel like another number or metric would be more appropriate.
Thanks. Another question I had was on the greenscape and how that plays into the Module 1 setback maximum requirements when you line that up with sidewalks and all that, and making sure we have room for utilities.
Christy,
Which
you want
could run under sidewalks.
to explain how the sidewalk requirement relates to setback requirements?
Yes, so that's a bit part of the question of where do sidewalks exist? Are they in the right of way? Are they in private property? Really, the idea is with I think by the green space requirement, you're talking about the outdoor amenity space requirement. Is that the question?
I was talking about the
Wanna make
greenscape buffer.
In the streetscape requirement, where we have the clear zone and the greenscape, those two things, and then how those two things relate to setbacks and maximum setback.
Right. So the way that we're setting setbacks is either from the property line. So if that streetscape exists fully in the right of way, then those minimum and maximum setbacks will be from your property line. But often whenever we have the smaller setback requirements in the mixed use districts, we'll say that those setbacks are from the sort of back of sidewalk, or what we're calling your clear walk zone, because that's what it's called in your streets that work plan. So that means that, you can have a bit more flexibility if that streetscape needs to have an easement on the private property. Does that make sense? The differentiation I'm drawing there?
So going back to Carl's question before, does the streetscape requirement exist in the right-of-way or on the private property? It's both. The main thing is that the requirement has to be met, and where is the space in which to meet it? And then the setbacks come off of back a sidewalk or property line, depending.
That makes sense. Another question, this goes back to earlier in the presentation on the fee in lieu calculation. That for if developers were going to pay in, where does that number come from, and how do we make sure that it actually equates to a real affordable units construction?
So that's described in the manual. The actual fee in lieu numbers are put in the manual, and there are different philosophies on how to make that calculation, different models, if you will. Some of them are based in the idea of what is that the fee in lieu is equated to the lost revenue, and there's some where the fee in lieu is equated to the cost of producing a unit. And depending on which route you take, it has different implications for what that number actually ends up being. And I don't know if we have I know the manual describes which of those models, and I'm blanking at the moment on that, but if we can pull up the manual, I can find
The
it.
revenue model.
What's that?
The
It's the revenue model. Thank you. I thought it was, but I, in the moment, couldn't remember.
Is that something we can change if we wanted to, or is that, I don't know which is better, but I'm
Right.
just asking. out
Yeah,
loud.
we can get some clarity as to what the outcomes are
It just
with
feels
either
like
model.
usually the numbers we see don't equate to actually what it would cost to really build an affordable unit, generally speaking.
Right, the
The
current
current-
code
currently.
language was provided to us by the state. And
Yeah.
so we had to use the formula that the state provides us, and we didn't have any other options. And so now we have the opportunity to create our own affordable housing plan that gives us some flexibility in how we do that.
Thank you.
they're a lot higher.
Okay.
The proposed is a lot higher than the current? Yeah, absolutely.
Ms. Russell?
I don't think I have any questions on the presentation.
Mr. Schwartz?
I think Kareem actually asked all my questions. And we're comfortable with the idea, because I feel like we're going to get a lot of pushback on the idea of still being able to pay for affordable units versus actually building them. But staff is feeling confident that we've got a fair equation that we're working with.
Yes.
Okay.
And I mean, my other statement on that regard is at least the best practice now in the realm of inclusionary zoning basically says that we have to offer that alternative.
Okay. That was, going to be my next follow-up.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was one of my questions is, our conversation around inclusionary zoning up to this point had been requiring the development of on-site units. And I'm certainly open to seeing more information, but just seeing that makes me pretty uncomfortable, both that we are not requiring affordable units to get built on site, how the formula will play out, whether we'll end up getting less affordable housing unit creation based on the payment in lieu, depending on how that's calculated, as well as one of the goals of inclusionary zoning being to desegregate income within housing. Will we repeat a pattern of putting affordable housing only in specific developments in areas of the city that inclusionary zoning would help desegregate in that way?
Yeah.
So seeing that, I'm uncomfortable and would like a lot more information and discussion before feeling comfortable and moving back to a payment in lieu
Yeah.
option.
I will note, and I don't disagree with anything you said. I think you're hitting on all the concerns that come with a fee in lieu anyway, and what we should be providing to you in terms of understanding that fee in lieu structure, the model, the formula that's being used. I mean, the one thing I'll say about the fact that affordable housing has often been kind of segregated to certain areas, that's a product of funding decisions, but it's also a product of zoning that our zoning ordinance is attempting to address, right? Because when affordable housing is primarily multifamily and multifamily is only allowed in certain areas, you right there have created that situation. But by, one of our intentions with the comprehensive plan is to spread out across the city where multifamily is allowed in order to create opportunities for affordable housing developers to build in other parts of the city.
I think I agree with your concerns too. And one thing that I'm thinking of is like it could be a potential source of funding to subsidize the 30% AMI and LIHTC projects that the city wants to invest in. So it's
Yeah, and I think a lot will come down to the details. I'm curious to know how that will be calculated, how it will work in practice, and whether we'll end up getting, if you were to add up the kind of the indirect subsidy that's going into building the units on site versus what they're going to pay, is what they're going to pay going to be less. So net, we're getting less affordable housing in the city, and every developer is going to choose that payment in lieu for that
Right.
reason, which has been the case with our current existing program, which is very different, but it's pretty much been a failure in terms of either producing on-site units or getting an equivalent amount of payment for if they struggling how to word it, but
No,
if they
but I
pay
get
the
it.
equivalent of what they
Yeah.
would need to pay to build them on site.
Right, right.
Mr. Stolzenberg.
Yeah, I mean, I just follow up by saying I'm also very interested in how these were calculated,
Yeah.
and how we arrived at these numbers in the first place, and how we fix them or like keep calculating them going forward. Because the goal needs to be to make sure that the in lieu payments are more attractive.
Right.
But a couple questions on that. There are different numbers for rentals and owner occupied in lieu. I'm assuming no one's living in a pile of cash. So those are for the rest of the project?
I'm sorry.
Like for a 1-bedroom or for a 2-bedroom, it's $360,000 for a rental in lieu payment, and then $230,000 for an owner occupied in lieu payment.
Yeah, I'm sure it goes back to the revenue model, and we'll just have to dig into it. This manual, one of the things we noted is it is very much a first draft, and one of the things that we have asked for and need to have in there is that the actual formula is provided, not just the numbers.
Yeah.
So we can
that
understand the
definitely.
basis for that. Yeah.
Cool. I guess I'll let you guys work out the kinks in the draft. The only other thing I'd say is on rounding, we're talking about rounding up to the next whole number, which generally makes a lot of sense, but given the formula we have, 10%, right? It would never be viable to make an 11-unit building,
Right.
or you're really knocking out everything between 11 and probably 18 or 19.
That's a big issue, and I think something worth talking about as we go forward. When you round up from point one, you significantly disincentivize those lower points, right? Because the whole purpose is that the project has an internal subsidy, right? All the market rate units, so every 10 market rate units are subsidizing one affordable unit, but when you're in those less than a whole unit situation, the points, and you're rounding up, you've got a fewer number of units providing that subsidy, and so it significantly disincentivizes them on the lower side.
And one easy way out of that maybe would be to have a fractional in lieu payment, right?
Right, absolutely.
I mean, I definitely want to see more details on that, but I won't belabor it. On blocks, just a minor point, I feel like there needs to be an exception for along railroad rights of way where you couldn't go through anyway. So Carlton Views would have been hit.
There should be an exception to that regard, but
right.
we will take that note, and
I only got 30 minutes to read this 80-page document. So.
we didn't expect this level of detail in the comments and questions, quite honestly. We thought we'd get there next time, but we wanted to provide an overview. But I'm impressed.
Cleared my whole calendar today. And then
Anybody surprised?
I didn't really. I just think the greenscape thing is a great idea and makes a ton of sense. That's all I have to say. That's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer.
think I had a similar vein of questions to the in lieu payment, because that's something we hadn't heard before. I didn't know if there was like, is that like a state requirement that you have to provide that option, or is this like a best practice?
It's not a requirement. It's just a best practice.
Okay.
If you read what people are talking about in terms of inclusionary zoning, particularly as we're looking at there's a lot of questions around that kind of a mandate, and so the response has been in the practice to provide options. And so the fee in lieu is generally the best option that most places are using.
Okay. And then the only other thing I'd mention, and I feel maybe I shouldn't even mention this, when we were talking about, preserving trees on sites and what incentives you might provide for that, I wonder if, I'm wondering out loud, if there might be reducing the minimum open space required, because you're kind of offering, by preserving the tree, or it's a really high quality open space, or something like that, if
So,
that's ever been thought about.
No, it hasn't, and certainly take the note. I think one of the things we're also working on, though, is making sure there's clear enforcement of that tree planting guideline, because one of the things we run into is when the open space area around the tree is not of sufficient size, we get encroachment into the canopy area, and the tree ends up
And then it
dying.
dies, yeah, then
Right.
you're
So
kinda
we need to actually hold that, and because we're particularly interested in preserving existing trees. As much as, planting is good, preserving is better if we can accomplish it.
Those are my comments.
Mainly just bouncing off of previous ideas. For in lieu, I'd encourage an idea of a net improvement. That we should see better because of in lieu, not worse because of in lieu.
I didn't catch the last part of what you said, I'm sorry.
So for in lieu payments for affordable housing, I'd recommend the concept of a net improvement versus on-site. That we should be getting more better versus on-site. We don't want worse, we don't want the same, we want better.
So play that. So if I'm doing a development project and I'm looking for the option, I can't incorporate them on site for some reason. The standard is that it. Tell me again.
That there would be more affordable housing at a deeper level for a longer
Gotcha.
time elsewhere.
Gotcha.
So the in lieu would need to.
The in lieu reflects a deeper level of affordability.
This is my suggestion. Assuming we can do that legally.
Right.
What is the reason that it wouldn't be feasible?
Well, one of the ones we hear a lot is about student housing. And I will recognize that student housing can be a challenge, and I'm treading outside of my direct area of expertise, but there are exceptions built into the federal law for student housing because students are inherently low income, but they're not really, right? So,
I mean, not necessarily.
well, right, some actually are, right? But
It's difficult to differentiate.
Yeah, there's a significant number of people who don't have income, but they're not poor.
It puts
Yeah.
a challenge on the developer or the
and on
owner
the
of
city for monitoring that requirement.
sure.
Because what ends up actually having to happen is you, under the federal law, you then have to go back to their home
Right.
family's income to make a determination.
Okay.
So we have generally accepted a fee in lieu for student
Give
housing.
me another example, not student housing.
Well, and then frankly, the reason it's there is because the best practice is to provide an option.
I'm just trying to think through, would that be the best practice for us?
Right.
And I think the other critical consideration in the payment in lieu is within our affordable housing strategy, making it explicit that that payment in lieu is not contributing to our $10 million a year commitment. Any payment in lieu is going above the
Above
10
and beyond.
million. Because I'm also concerned that becomes a backdoor way to
Yeah.
invest less city money in housing.
I don't, yeah. Leave it.
Last comment, we have a budget, we have a capital plan, we can pay money for trees, that is an incentive. I urge us to remember this in budget season. Mr. Payne?
I mean, big questions. I think a lot of people have already asked. Obviously, the payment in lieu. A question about, you know, the module 2 was sent to us 30 minutes before this meeting, so I haven't read through it in depth. But having searched through it, one of my questions is something we had discussed as one of the affordable housing incentives is modeling what they had done in New Haven with incentivizing inclusionary zoning for a developer to have at least one of the required affordable units be paired with a voucher.
Yeah.
I didn't see that reflected in Module 2, either the summary or the documents sent today. I would really like to at least see an analysis of it or a serious contemplation of it, because that will allow inclusionary zoning to get to 0 to 30% AMI and help us work through our waiting list for vouchers, which is hundreds and hundreds of people long.
Yeah, 100% agree. We need to do more work in that space.
The other question I have is, again, just scanning through the Module 2 documents sent today, a concern that there doesn't seem to really be any clear definition of the sensitive communities designations and what that will actually mean. And I'm curious what that will look like, because I'll keep hammering it, but I'm very concerned about these lots that are a high percentage of lower income renters who are not subsidized. And if you upzone with no protections and you have a flood of capital investment come in, they can very easily be completely screwed over. And I don't see anything defined yet on how to conceptualize or deal with that problem.
We did release a document looking at the overall issue of sensitive communities in conjunction with the release today. So that should be on the website. But what you will find is that we are still feeling like we need to have conversations with the affected communities to continue to talk about this issue, because it is a challenging issue. Let's talk about that flood of capital you're referring to. That flood of capital is coming into many of our sensitive community areas right now under our existing zoning ordinance in the form of single-family homes that are being flipped, either in a tear-down scenario or a significant addition or expansion scenario. So we're seeing that happen without changing the zoning ordinance. When we create a zoning ordinance that increases the options available for property owners, potentially increases value for property owners, if we roll that back for those sensitive communities areas, we are actually denying those individuals that same wealth building opportunity.
Yeah.
So we're having that conversation with residents from those communities to say, hey, where do you lean in this? And right now the conversation is mostly, not entirely, but mostly saying we lean towards more restriction right now.
And that's why my primary concern is high concentration of lower income renters. Because if the owner is an out-of-state LLC, but they're just completely screwed. Again, like our existing mobile home parks, I think it may be easy for us to minimize, yes, there's already an existing risk, but for those specific parcels, will we accelerate that risk substantially even further? And I want to be clear, that's not a reason to not do anything, citywide, but I think we really need to have some care for those specific parcels and risk that I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And like I said, it's one of those areas where we've done a lot of looking into the literature and trying to see what are other communities doing, and everybody's wrestling with this issue and everybody is not finding clear answers. And so we're trying to be sensitive and trying to talk to residents in those neighborhoods in particular about what our pathway forward is. The other thing I will say is that I strongly believe that zoning is in reality a very, very small part of the answer. And the bigger part is to invest in things like we're already doing in tax relief and investing in direct ways of achieving community ownership in order to actually create long-term protection for the affordability of property.
Definitely.
Like community land trusts and similar. There's a number of different strategies out there that communities are exploring.
Definitely agree with that, and definitely appreciate that, particularly when it comes to homeowners. That's a different conversation than renters, but really difficult.
Yeah.
In terms of whether people want to cash out.
But a lot of those ownership models in terms of land trust and the like, can also tackle renters and hold property, hold rents down.
For sure. Community land trusts are great.
Yeah.
But I think for questions for now, that's it for me.
Mayor Snook.
Well, first of all, I apologize for coming in about 5:30. Had a jury trial that didn't want to get over in time. I confess, not having been here for the presentation, and I gather you're taking comments about the presentation, I don't have much to add.
I appreciate your restraint. Mr. Wade, you were here.
No additional comments.
Thank you. Anything more on Module 2? It's fresh, it's new?
Actually,
Please.
well, part of this, actually, Counselor Payne took the words right out of my mouth on the back door to the investment, but it occurs to me that if we're establishing a higher density and build rate, that this in lieu, no matter what, that revenue stream is going to go up considerably over present.
Could.
And if that's the case, that even though it doesn't equal the cost of building a unit, it may provide us with an opportunity on an economy of scale to leverage that a bit more, particularly if we're leveraging it, as Mr. Abib said, on LIHTC stuff, et cetera. So I think it's worth doing. And I had something on density and bonus, but I think it's much more appropriate to discuss it in the Module 1 and setbacks issue, so I'll defer on that.
Module 1, what a great idea. You got Module 2 on me?
I got one more
Hit me.
thing. I did want to talk briefly about the low density zone or the R zone bonus.
Sure.
The 100% affordable requirement.
Yep.
So I think we all agree that the goal of doing that, of letting the affordable housing providers build more, is so that they can outcompete, private builders to buy a lot, right? So that say Habitat or the Land Trust can buy a lot for the price of a lot with 6 development rights on it rather than 12, right? And so it seems to me that it would make a lot more sense for all of the incremental units to be affordable, to be required to be affordable, so that market rate developer doesn't get any additional benefit still. So the price remains, the price of a lot with 6 development rights, but the Land Trust can now buy it, build their 6, and then sell off additional 6, up to 6 to private builders, meaning the Land Trust can now buy that lot for the price of a lot with 6 development rights minus the price of 6 lots that are smaller, like half the size. And then they can buy it for very little, in fact, much less even than the lot price in the first place that we're keeping. So I guess I would say incremental units instead of 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not the decider.
Thoughts on that idea? I'm struggling. Could you try that again?
So,
Thank you.
So
I don't
Give me an example.
in the R zone, so like RB is up to 6 units, and then if it's in this draft, they're 100%. If all 12 are affordable, you can build up to 12. So I'm saying the 6 by right units should be allowed, and then the next 6 units should need to be affordable. That way, an affordable housing developer can buy it, build 6 units or 12 units if they want. But if they build 6 units, then they can recoup the cost that the money that they used to buy the property, and in fact, get the property for probably very little on net.
I guess,
No, sorry, not following.
I mean, I
I
don't
think you're
know the
skipping
answer to
You're
that.
skipping a key step in there it's recouping, it's not getting it for cheaper.
Yeah, recouping. Yeah. So yeah, in the end, it's for cheaper. So they're going to use half the lot and build 6, and then there are still 6 left. 6 market rate units allowed, right? Which if there weren't 6 affordable units, 6 market rate would be all that's allowed. And so I'm saying they build 6 affordable units, and then 6 market rates are still allowed, and then the land trust can then sell those lots to private or sublots to private developers, and recoup the money, some of the money.
But under option 2, all the units have to be affordable.
Yeah, so I'm
And so
suggesting
you're
changing that to the
suggesting-
incremental units.
I agree with the way he's got it written now. I think all of them should be affordable.
That's
Because-
not, I think you're, at the end of the day, they're all affordable, but there's some.
No, the first 6, I think he suggested to be market rate. So they
That's
can-
like Mr. Stolensberg's talking in this scenario, that it would be 50% on that site would be affordable.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I'd rather
but it
go
would
with
be at the
100%.
discretion of the affordable housing provider, right? Like, they are the only ones who can unlock that value.
Yeah, because no one can do 50% affordable anyways.
Yeah, you couldn't,
So-
only they could,
Yeah,
right?
so you're
Yeah.
giving them the option to,
We can't set up bonuses based on ownership of the land. So that is something to keep in mind. It has to be a criteria that.
An owner is an
the
owner is an
general
owner.
Criteria.
So that there would have to be a deed restricted affordable housing built, and so you'd really have to build the affordable units before or at the same time as any market rate units.
Right.
It wouldn't just be that the land trust could own the front half and then the back half they could sell off. They'd have to build the units.
They have to be done concurrently, yes.
Mhm.
No, but, and the bonus as the ordinance is written has no restriction in terms of who can take advantage of the bonus. It's just understood that only an affordable housing developer relying
Would.
on some form of subsidy would be able to, because it doesn't pencil out and never would pencil out on its own.
Right. And I guess I'd also say, like, Habitat's model is often to do this, right? If you go to, like, Harmony Ridge on Fish Street, they built all the affordable duplexes in the back, and then in the front there are 4 lots that they recently sold off to a market rate builder to help recoup some of that cost that they can use on the next project.
Are you also saying that in a land trust scenario, would be very hard for them to do 100% because it's like doubling up on the
Well,
sunk cost of.
I wouldn't necessarily
cost.
say that, but it means that the land cost for them will be the price. At best, the land cost per unit that they have will be half of what a market rate developer could get, right? Because the cost of the land is what the cost of a land with, or of a plot with 6 development rights on it for a market rate is.
Yeah, but you can work that in reverse. Market rate developer can come along and say, all right, here's what I'm gonna do, because I can get a partial recoupment myself, and I can make 6 units, and so it
Yeah, so they
works
could
in-
say, I have some extra land in the back, I'm gonna sell that to Habitat and get a little mixed income component to my development, and recoup a little bit of money.
Yeah,
Actually, those two are kind of the same. In the end, they'll.
No, not necessarily, because it's going to be the for-profit people who can do that, because Habitat is your example, and maybe PHA, but generally speaking, most nonprofit affordable housing providers do not have the capital excess to pull that off. So it's a problem in terms of having to carry that for a period of time.
Sure,
But
yeah, I guess-
I would say, however, I'm a yes and on that. I agree with Commissioner Mitchell on this, that the 100% I think should stand, but looking at that idea in some other circumstances, and I don't know what they are, to sort of try to pressure and push that, I just, as a method, yes, but I think the 100%, if we're going to double density, or maybe you can triple density if it's 100%, and if we double density, we can do it this way.
How about the nodes?
I want to add something just quickly. I think there is a benefit there in that I think with our definition, 100% would have to be 60% AMI or below. And some of our nonprofits do provide 80%, and you can allow people to stay in the same building and not have to move out if they get a raise.
What I would direct you to is the manual in terms of how we manage and monitor and enforce the affordability requirements over time addresses that particular issue
Okay.
and would be applicable in this scenario as well. It basically says once a tenant is in place, they can get up to 100% of AMI before they then have to go.
So they have to go within 3 months if they hit 100% of
As it's written.
I mean, that,
So they still have to go.
No.
they still have to go eventually. If they hit.
If they get past
if
100%
they're
of
the-
AMI, they have a lot more choices in the marketplace.
Sure, but you're only saying they're getting to the median and then we're kicking them out,
Fair enough.
right?
Fair
And
enough. Hey,
so,
or we move it, but that's where we put the number to date, in order to address specifically that issue.
Yeah, and I'll, at this point, I don't feel comfortable making a decision to alter it from being 100% affordable. Before I would make a decision to change that, I would like some more time to think through how it's likely to
Right.
actually work in practice.
Right.
Mr. Schwartz?
So I'm intrigued by this, and I think it makes sense to me in that it's, I think what we're gonna get in the RB district is, no affordable housing built. It's all gonna be 6 units, market rate, and then we'll get like the one person who's gonna do a nonprofit that's gonna get all the grant funding and everything else to do their 12 unit building. Whereas if it was 6 units and then every additional unit was affordable, I do think we might actually end up seeing more affordable units popping up. Because again, it'll be like the habitats and the Piedmont, PHAs out there will, I think, be able to take advantage of that.
Every other unit is affordable, and then what's the corresponding bonus to that? How does the bonus?
No, not you do the 6 units, and then the 7th unit is affordable, the 8th unit's affordable.
Yeah, but
the 9th unit's-
what bonus does that allow? What does that allow the developer to do?
the developer can sell their lot to Habitat, which
Yeah.
will have to be on the cheap
So
because
it's-
the only buyers could be Habitat or the land trust. Nonprofits willing to do this, but
You're
But isn't
running,
it a height? Isn't
I
there a
think we're
height?
gonna dive down into a very complicated series of how transactions can work, how they can't, rights to land, use and all of that, and it's 6:10 and we haven't touched module 1.
Yeah.
We may
Thank you-
table
thank
this.
you for that.
circle back
Yeah.
on this.
Staff know
Yeah.
about this? They're going to look at this?
We can look at it, but I also want to note that at the end of the day, that the decision to create that density bonus, that doubling, was effectively a compromise position, right? Because our starting point was that we're trying to maintain building scales within the RB and the RC in particular that are house scale. And that was something that staff was really focused on accomplishing, but there was a request from particularly affordable housing developers that was presented back in September, asking for some compromise in this space, and this is what we came back with. So, in some respects, it's not about creating more opportunities for affordable housing so much as just creating an opportunity for affordable housing for affordable housing developers within those spaces. But
So I have a quick question
Please.
when you finish this line of questioning.
I mean, I guess I'd just say to that, well, this would give more rights to the affordable housing developers and make their jobs easier, which, maybe is not enough of a reason. But to me, I think a lot of the reason why we wanted affordability bonuses or some kind of affordability component of the medium intensity definition was that we wanted to create mixed income communities.
Yep.
And get those, regulated affordable units, both in neighborhoods and within specific, developments like 12-plex.
Sure.
And this would inherently create
Sure.
mixed income.
Mr. Wade?
If it's concerning that, you can go ahead.
It's a
and
really
start.
quick question.
Yeah.
Please.
In our RA, there is an incentive to do an affordable unit. In RB and RC, am I understanding correctly, we don't have any sort of bonus for affordability?
no, it's the same one we were talking about.
Well,
It's
but
in
I mean,
RA,
other than the
RB, and
going-
RC.
Other than going to the full doubling of, other than going 100% affordable, there is no other affordable
In the
bonus or
RB,
incentive?
RA and RB and RC, yeah.
Okay. So,
Because for the purposes, the analysis our team has done has determined that at that scale of development, you're not gonna do it with a for-profit development model.
okay, that's right. I just want to make sure I got it.
The existing building bonus.
In RA, but RB and RC there's nothing.
Mr. Wade?
So,
RB, that's what changed that they were recommending, that it be added to RB, right?
We were talking about RA, RB, and RC altogether is what we were talking about.
What RA bonus are you talking about?
You can go up to 4 if you have It's just
If you-
keeping the existing.
if you
Existing-
keep the
Yeah.
existing
Yeah.
structure.
So I'm getting,
Yeah.
sorry, yeah.
Well,
Got
I
it. I-
thought that was when we just
Counselor
talked about-
Wade,
So-
put me out of my misery.
Please.
It's sparked something else, this conversation about what you said about kind of keeping existing buildings and try to kind of remove the kind of scrape and replace type
Yep.
of model in the first 25 feet. So is that just you want to keep the facade of it, or you really want to keep the existing home? Or
We're-
what?
I mean, the incentive is built around retaining the existing structure, existing building, existing home. We've defined that at the first 25 feet to get beyond the facade, but recognize that at the back of the building, part of how people are going to accomplish the additional units is by putting an addition on that existing building. So that's what we're working towards.
That's all for now.
Okay. Last call on module 1. Sorry, module 2. These numbers.
I mean, yeah, I got it, but it's.
Let's talk module 1. I'd like to start with a round robin on where we are, and then we're going a deep dive, which maybe we'll do a break before, depending on how we're feeling. Mr. Mitchell, module 1, how are you feeling?
I like where we are. I've got a couple of questions about setbacks and a couple of questions about the comment that Roy made on page 2 of his document, and complemented by something that Mr. Schwartz made in his document. No, it was side setbacks from Roy. Sorry, I'm confusing setbacks and side setbacks. Never mind, we'll get to setbacks in a minute. Mr. Schwartz suggested something about setbacks that I thought was intriguing, but I'm getting ahead of myself. A question: Are there any setbacks? Are there any zero setbacks in the city today? And if there are, where are they?
Some of the mixed-use districts have
Have zero
zero.
setback.
They're usually maximum minimums, so there are a few of those left.
In the next iteration, we're looking to have zero setbacks. And where are they?
So Christy and I are both going to answer these questions, and I'm going to kick it to Christy for most of these questions, because she's obviously the author of the standards. So Christy, I'm going to kick it to you. Can you share with us where the 0-foot setbacks are?
Yeah, and so I'm going to speak explicitly to side setbacks. If we want to talk about front setbacks, we can talk about that in a different
I'm really
question.
interested in front setbacks for the moment. I do want to talk
Oh, you're
about
talking about
side
front.
setbacks, but I may even defer that to you when we get to that. The thing that worries me again is trees.
Yeah.
Again, zero setbacks, they hurt that. But Mr. Schwartz had an interesting idea, I thought, and you may not remember it, that maybe we do allow zero setbacks if in fact that creates a place to have open space where trees can be planted or moved. I wonder if you could just chat a little bit about your idea as relates to that.
It was really half-baked, and I'm just wondering if there is some way we
Let's-
can
let's see if we can make it a little
incentivize,
bit.
you know, if, I think we need to have the trees. So if that means that we have to have a 10-foot setback everywhere, then we need to do that. But maybe there's an incentive that you can have a 0-foot setback if you bury your power lines and if the trees can be in the right-of-way. Or if there's some sort of, just throwing that out there. I mean, the power lines are one thing that, yeah, is there some incentive we can somehow bury in this code to, get those buried?
Yes.
Yeah,
So
and,
that's what's so cool to me about this greenscape idea. It seems like that it does
yeah.
that.
Well, it does and
The
it doesn't.
greenscape,
The
it's in module.
the streetscape, when I just quickly looked at it, it looked like they put the power lines in the green strip. And if you have those, then you don't get canopy trees, you get small trees spaced every 20 feet. So we still have the power lines as a problem. But yeah, just throwing out there, is there some sort of incentive that, you can get your 0-foot setback if you can prove that trees can go someplace?
And that's similar to what Mr. Palmer was suggesting, that maybe we use the open space as allow folks not to have the required open space if in fact there are going to be trees there, and we can move the building closer to the road if there's open space that can accommodate trees. So just throwing that out there to think about.
Yeah. Christy, is there anything on utilities that you have experience with that you can share?
I would need to dig into your state statutes because it is kind of a state by state basis on if you can require that or not. So I think it's a great thing we can look into, and getting power lines buried as much as possible is absolutely a goal. And so I think it's something that we continue to look into, and that may be a legal question, frankly.
There was an interesting comment that we got from at least 3 people, and it was relating to RA zoning around schools, and wondering if maybe there may be a safety issue relating to that, because it's going to drive higher. Or is RA or RC? RC. We got RC near Seaville High and Walker, I think. And there are questions about, kids walking to school these days, and the increased density driving increased traffic. And there were suggestions that we ought to be a little cautious about that kind of density around places like Walker and Seaville High.
Yeah. So, I mean, as I noted early on, we are taking every single one of the mapping comments we've gotten, and we're going to be doing an analysis of each one of those comments and bring that back in the next version of the map. I think that is a significant policy question that we're going to need you guys to engage on. I suggest we hold that for a dedicated map conversation, perhaps. But the policy question really boils down to one of the reasons the comprehensive plan directed greater density towards amenities like schools was to increase the population who would have the opportunity to walk to schools. So there's a push and pull there, and I think that's a valid conversation that needs to be had.
Carl and I work out at ACAC every day, and we watch all these little kids walking down that street from Clark, and it's like frightening sometimes when they're crossing the streets without looking up for the cars. So just something to think about.
And it also plays into all the work that we are doing and need to do around safe routes to school and traffic safety generally. Like, we have a lot of work to do in that space, and recognize that there's a challenging dichotomy there too that we found with the pandemic. One of the things we saw is when the traffic volumes went down, the speed went up, right? Because unfortunately the way, and this is, I'm just speaking now broadly in kind of suburban America generally, we've built for high capacity, lots of cars, and then when there's fewer cars, the speed goes up, people drive faster. Again, it's a challenging issue.
And I don't know if you wanted to get into this level of minutia, but the zoning, again, this is another thing that we talked about before, and Rory brought it up. The Crescent Hall zoning is, maybe that's too much minutia, but a little problematic, because I think they're looking to expand that area, and currently the current zoning would be pretty restrictive.
Right.
And that's an excellent affordable housing opportunity that we need to maybe upzone a bit. I think you actually recommended NX 10 for that. So.
Yep. So if we've got it on the list from Rory, we have it on the list. Great.
And side setbacks.
Mr. Duranzia, Module 1.
I guess you get it.
So, much like you, Mr. Chairman, I had wild ambitions about my ability to get the bandwidth to take a deep dive, and when I finally got around to do that, I got somewhat into it and then decided to go back and read your comments and Commissioner Schwartz and Commissioner Stolzenberg, which was delightful because I did save myself a lot of repetition. So a lot of this is yes and. I have something on side lots that is almost as wacky as Commissioner Stolzenberg, and I'll sort of give an outline of that. But I'll circle back to that, and I'm just sort of flying over at 30,000 feet. Carl, I think, is right that we. I don't like this. I don't like the tone of RA's restrictions. not in their setbacks, not in the uses, not in the, I think that it seems to me that we are piling on a lot of requirements into RA that probably do not have, that don't show a clear benefit to me, either in terms of zoning in general or in terms of affordable housing or in terms of even attacking some of the problems we say we want to attack. And I think we need to take a look at a lot of that. And I got a lot of problems with setbacks, and Carl dove into that somewhat, and I'm even more agnostic to being blasphemous on a couple of that. That's one. Two, I think we need to delete every single word in this that says anything about marital status, family, blood relationship, or anything like that. That is a straight-up legacy of classism, misogyny, homophobia, et cetera. It all needs to go. I think that we're essentially defining to somebody, to third party, what somebody's household or family is or isn't. We need to find some other way of accessing that.
Do you have examples? Because I know one of the intentions was to delete those, and I see Christy nodding her head.
Yeah, we have one on.
I think it may be the adult living standard, and just so everyone is aware, that use standard, we carried forward a lot of those from the existing code. So a lot of the comments you all have are things that we've heard a lot, and we are certainly looking at making sure we're getting all of those legacy issues out.
Yeah,
but please continue to point them out on a case-by-case basis.
And I'll admit that I have a virulent, visceral, and almost testicular objection to that. So there's that. I think I see a lot of us getting sort of tied up in stories versus height.
Mm-hmm.
And that with RA, I'd like to back into that and say, let's push this to the building code. Let's talk about height and let the building code, and let's determine things like stories and ceiling heights and in sort of that, and to whatever we can push to the building code. And in general in RA, I mean, this is the highest density of proportionally owner-occupied primary residences. This is the home. It's not a commercial enterprise. And unless we can come up with a really good reason to not do something, let it ride. As a general philosophy. And I just see that, I think that RA is just a little too tight for that. I've got some thoughts on, as you know, the HAC pushed out some work product on density from the newly constructed HAC. Put together a subcommittee to look at Module 1, and I can distribute out their response. But in general, look at really bumping up the density for affordable housing and really privileging density even greater extent than we have, and doing the same thing with height. And I think that that's worthy of a discussion there. And now, side lots. In lieu of the current setbacks, which seem to be overly complicated to me, particularly when you're talking about frontage versus width of lots. Good point that lots are wonky shaped, and let's look at the frontage first and side lots. I would, and particularly since topography in these smaller lots can be what they're going to be, can we look at something like a side setback that is measured in aggregate? So let's say side setback, just for an example, is the minimum setback in aggregate for both sides is 10 feet. For any given side is 3 feet, to pick a number. What that means in effect in these RAs, and then have an exception for common wall, right? For common wall residences. What that would do is that would in effect put 6 feet minimum between buildings or 10 feet minimum between buildings there. I see we're already backing up on parking in front yards. I think we need to simplify that. Your rear bumper needs to be 8 feet off the curb. That's that. It's got to be, your tires have to be on an impermeable surface. And let's go with that. Or off the, whatever, you know, or off the amenity, or whatever that is, if there's a sidewalk or something that impinges on that 8 foot. So those are sort of my initial run-through thoughts. Happy to dig into any of them later once everyone's had their bite of the apple.
Responses or concerns on that from the team?
I know I jumped around a little
Stunned silence.
Is that for me?
Team or staff the team?
Staff and Ms. Dotson of the
Okay.
team.
James, do you want to respond to any of that? I would like to hear everybody's comments unless there's specific questions.
That works for me.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, it was still pretty general in the comment, so
Well, I wanted, in the interest of time, to say these are the things I'm thinking
Yeah.
about. If you want me to give you the next level of detail, I can.
Yeah, I mean, no.
Help you all. No, good.
I mean, I think just where I'm going to come back from is what the district standards are trying to accomplish, right? So you're identifying many of those district standards as being obstacles. I'm identifying them as trying to accomplish what we believe when we read the comprehensive plan was intended in terms of striking a balance between accommodating greater densities within all of our neighborhoods while recognizing while ensuring that development is, I think the word we used, familiar to those existing neighborhoods, right? And so when we think about scale, that's one of the things we're trying to get to. But also when we think about how do we ensure that new development comes into the neighborhood and is promoting things like walkability, safety and comfort in the neighborhood and on the streets. And that's where we come to things like entrance requirements and transparency requirements and those types of things. So I'm happy to discuss a balance, but I want to put a stake in the ground that those requirements aren't being put in there. We're not suggesting those as aesthetic rules. We are suggesting those as rules that accomplish real public objectives.
Yeah, my concern, particularly with RA, and, you know, Carl, feel free to jump in with the next level of detail on these, because you went into some precise stuff there, is that we are we can make things difficult, particularly with smaller lots with odd topographies. And we're also, I think, sort of stifling some ways to adapt to that by sort of taking certain things off the table. And, you know, I can speak to the transparency, but I think you'll do a better job than I can speak to the, you know, the rear setback seems to be, some of it seems to be superfluous. But, yeah, I mean, I'm also trying to attack the parking situation with something that's, you know, it's not going to get better unless we start making dramatic changes in the residential areas.
Sure.
So.
Right, and again, today it's at the end of the day, it's about priorities and where the priorities get laid out within the zoning ordinance.
Right,
So
and I had
you
one
dig
other
into each
comment. I had
thing.
one other comment on the manufactured housing. One, only being allowed is parks in one zone in the city. I'd like some sort of depth on that. There's only one district that allows that. And secondly, the requirements to me seem to be a bear trap to make it just about impossible to put in a small park.
Put in you mean a
Small mobile home park.
mobile home park?
Yeah, it's a bit of a bear trap.
Okay.
Mr. Abab?
Thanks. I think outside of some of the comments that Carl and Rory sent already, I can send you a note and say which ones I like second, I guess. I think everything was brought up in the last work session, and that I don't have any comments. I'm going to look at Module 1 and 2 together and try to kind of piece together where the trees and the landscape fall and how that works out.
Thank you. Ms. Russell?
I want to go back to something that was discussed in Module 1 that James said, and this is around the sort of height, story debacle or you know, crux, but you said, I think 3 stories will result in more single-family teardowns. And the concern I have in that statement, and then maybe just moreover, is encouraging a situation in which small, yes, single-family, but, you know, sort of maybe naturally affordable rental, potentially rental units, landlords are incentivized to sell because they realize they, you know, can make more money selling to a developer to put in something that is maybe it is denser, but it's not affordable, and therefore we've just lost some rental stock or some sort of modest, maybe it's historic, maybe it's not, but like it's historic in the sense of it exists and is kind of older. So I don't know what the answer is there, but I just want us to really, really think about that when we're talking about this, the residential area. Then my other kind of observation in reading a lot of Carl and maybe Rory's, but more so Carl's comments, and in talking to Kareem as an architect, was it seems like some of your commentary, Carl, was like, I don't know why we would need to do this. No one's ever going to do this, and no one would ever build like that. And that's coming from your position as an architect, and not everyone that develops in this city is an architect, and so I would just go, well, like, I would want to understand, and I haven't, delved in, and it's not my expertise, like, what would we be giving up? What are the potential ramifications of this? And in my, I don't know, in my mind, developers like to be told what to do. Like, they like to have very clear parameters. So sometimes those regulations are actually, helping a project move along. And that's all I have to think about right now.
Mr. Schwartz.
Well, I guess starting with setbacks, so I need to reevaluate setbacks based on the whole streetscape thing that you provided today. I think that opens up a lot of opportunities. But for side yard setbacks, I guess my one comment is we've got 4 feet, which seems strangely arbitrary in the RA district. When 5 feet is a building code rule for you don't have to rate the wall, you can have as many windows as you want. It just seems between 4 and 5, I think I'm willing to give up that 1 foot to make it easier for the permit office to not have to deal with all that, at least in RA.
Sure.
Seems to make sense to just keep it there. But the
Christy, is there a basis for the 4 feet beyond? I mean, this is something that we've talked about amongst staff as well. Christy, what's the basis for the 4 feet?
It's essentially to provide that little bit of extra flexibility. We've heard from a lot of infill developers that sometimes in places where you have lots that are 35, 40, 50 feet wide, that extra foot really makes a difference, especially if you're, trying to save a tree or squeeze a driveway by an existing house. And, people are kind of willing to do more limited windows and do some, pretty minor fire rating that you can get to with some, fire rated plywood on that side of the building. So it really is just letting the building code do what the building code needs to do from a fire rating perspective, while letting zoning get out of the way and provide that little bit of extra flexibility. Some communities go even down to 3 feet in their sort of in-town, more lower scale density districts, because it's just a bit more flexibility.
I'm not going to push hard on that because and that makes sense. It just seemed like it was a strange thing, but thank you for explaining that. That makes sense.
Sure.
I mean, a complaint I was hearing is that people can't do townhouses in the RB and RC, and I guess they can, but they can't go up to their property line. And I feel like that's something that would be worth discussing as a group at some point, whether a 0 foot setback is desirable in RB and RC. I do feel kind of strongly that at least for RA, that some of the we've got too many requirements. That it's we don't need to be monitoring transparency in windows on a single family house or a duplex. It just seems kind of It seems a little silly to me. I mean, no one's gonna, well, someone might build a house with no windows, but that, you know, that, let crazy architects be crazy architects. And it's,
Violate
I-
building code.
well, yes.
Well, I
that is
will
true.
say, it's, I mean, it's less about no windows entirely, but what I have seen, particularly on narrow sites, is where developers are putting in a kind of standard house, and particularly if they have multiple sites right next to each other, and they decide, all right, I'm putting the kitchen and the master bath and built-in closet at the front of the house. And those have small to no windows, and you do end up with a frontage with very limited window frontage. And again, I will go to bat for the safety and sense of community that comes from, and that's safety for the people, the public safety aspects of having a street where there's windows, where I can at least have the sense that that somebody can see me, versus a street where those windows are small and constrained.
Okay.
So that's where and I have seen those narrow lots get developed with that kitchen master bath layout, because it means that they can put a big family room overlooking that forested stream valley below, because it means that that's the pattern that I came out of the book that I purchased, and the numbers work, it's cheap, and I can do it. So that's the basis.
And the other way that would go, I think, is like, you could have, if you were developing like 3 in a townhouse format that kind of went into the lot, you could just have a big empty wall that's the side of the townhouse facing the street rather than like the front of a house.
That's true, and that's one of the outcomes when we get into the RB and RC is those townhouses that go into the lot. Yeah.
Okay. If everybody's in agreement on that, then I'll completely back off. It just seemed like it was, it seemed that at least in RA, that we shouldn't be quite as hands-on as we are on this.
Christy, is there anything we're missing on that?
I think the sort of front to back townhouse is exactly why we do both the transparency, and it's also why we do the active depth requirement. You know, you think about it in those sort of front to back townhouses, and also when they turn a corner on a corner lot. Really fundamentally, a lot of these requirements are about getting people space in the front of the building and making sure that anything that's like a garage around the back, that blank wall, that sort of car space is pushed to the back and away from the corner of the lot. So the things that do that are the entry requirements, the transparency requirements, and also the active depth work really in tandem. I will say that there's a lot of flexibility built in. So these requirements, if you read through the rules of interpretation that are after the zoning districts for things like active depth. So once you're back, I think 20 feet back from the property line, then active depth goes away. Even ground story requirements, those go away. So it provides a lot more flexibility, particularly in RA, when particularly existing houses, and we're looking at the existing setback lines, they're going to be outside of that requirement. So it's essentially, it doesn't apply whenever you're back far enough from the property line. So there is a good bit of flexibility built in.
That actually.
And one other thing I want to touch on, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the comment on townhouses and the 0 foot lot line, I do want to remind everybody about sublots. So the setbacks apply to zoning lots, and the sublots can have 0 foot setbacks. And so you could plat townhouses on sublots that could be individual owners, and those can be 0 lot line developments.
You brought up another question of mine, which was, so we've got some neighborhoods, like around the high school or kind of Greenbrier areas, where the houses are actually very far back from the street and have fairly small backyards. And I guess I just wanted to bring up with the rest of the group is the way I'm reading the code is that any new construction would have to match the existing setbacks of the surrounding houses. Are we okay with that, in that it might limit quite a bit of construction?
No. Put the house wherever you want to put it on your lot, as long as I don't see I think that just promotes, from what I see, that promotes homogeneity.
And do I understand the code correctly, that that's what we're currently proposing, is that if all your neighbors have a 30, 40 foot setback, you have to have that same setback?
The way that we have it currently
I know
written
our
for
current
that
one says
standard,
well,
and I'm flipping through to make sure I say this right. You either can adhere to the prescribed setback range of the district or the established setback range of the block. And it's not even the full block. It's sort of the two houses on either side. And so we say that you can be no closer than the closest and no further back than the furthest. And that essentially is an established, what we're calling an established setback range.
So that's an
I'll
either
need
or.
to, yeah.
Okay, I did not know that. Okay. Good.
So that's why it's an or in there.
That definitely clarifies that. I very much understand the reason for the maximum coverages, but I do just want to bring up, in the R1S districts, a lot of those are pretty small lots, and they're already close to those, well, maybe not. It would be very difficult to add much to those lots. So in a sense, I guess one benefit would be those are mostly sensitive communities, so you wouldn't be seeing a lot of development in there, but is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I just kind of wanted to make sure that we all saw that. I know, my own lot, I'm not sure I could get another dwelling unit on there and meet your coverage requirements. Transparency and active depth, completely understand, but again, just want to bring up the idea, are we going to lose things? Like, are we not going to be able to have a grocery store because of that? Or, I'm thinking of some of the historic stuff on the mall. A lot of the side streets don't have windows, and I guess it's nice because they're historic and they're historic bricks, so you don't really notice, but like we wouldn't have the Violet Crown because they've got a whole blank wall that goes down the entire street. And just make sure that we know what we're giving up for that. Or maybe there's a way that someone can overcome that. I know you've got all those different features for how to deal with blank walls, but I think you still have to have the transparency. Am I correct in that?
That's right.
Okay.
And so, we have split transparency into primary streets and secondary streets. And, we're always open to hearing feedback on if those metrics need to be dialed up or down some to accommodate some existing patterns that may be unique to certain areas, then that's really valuable feedback for us.
Yeah, I personally don't know what the answer is because I think the transparency makes a lot of sense until we get a use group that we want that doesn't meet that those requirements. You guys have my list, so those are kind of the really, really big things. Lot widths and a lot of the mixed-use districts, and I think Lyle may have brought that up as well. Our traditional lots are like 25 feet, 30 feet?
25 to 30.
So I don't know why we've got 60 foot or 40 foot or whatever it is in some of the mixed-use districts. So it just seems like we should be able to reduce those quite a bit. I don't even know why we need a minimum, to be completely honest.
Yeah, we can look at lot minimums. The reason it seems a little non-intuitive to have a wider lot width minimum for the downtown and the node districts, but the reason we do that is because we're differentiating between lots that have front drive access and lots that have either no vehicular access or it's from the side or rear. And so what we're really trying to do is incentivize that side and rear or no vehicle access. And so that's when the lot sizes go down to that, I believe it's 15 feet. I need to double check. But that's the idea, is that almost all of those existing lots that are really narrow either have no vehicular access or it's from the side or rear. And so that's the pattern we want to continue to deploy. And maybe that's just it. Maybe that's the lot minimum, or it could be nothing even for those districts because it is an existing pattern. We generally think that lot frontage or that minimum width is sort of it's more important in our mind than the area of the lot because it's what you perceive that sort of sets the pattern. So in those districts, we don't have lot area minimums because it kind of doesn't matter for someone walking down the street, right? How deep or shallow the lot is. So we think of that width as setting the pattern. So maybe something like a standardized minimum that's smaller than what we're proposing makes more sense.
Okay.
And Am I right that right now there are no restrictions outside of residential on subdivisions? Yeah, lot sizes or frontage, like widths?
Yeah, it's just in the residential areas currently.
Yeah, so, I mean, to me, I think that sticking with that would make sense.
Well, it's pros and cons, because, you know, if you don't have something, then you can get big blank walls, so.
Oh, yeah,
it's a
yeah.
Combination, you know.
I keep the maxes, but
Yeah.
take away the minimums is what I'm saying, yeah. And, I mean, I guess maybe you worry about spite strips as like a super thin lot, but I don't know that we need to, I don't know. Spite strips.
They happen, they make interesting architecture. I'm gonna stop. Someone else can talk, but that was, yeah.
Well, and they wouldn't come up necessarily because you have to have a buildable lot in order for it to be subdivided per the code. So there are existing cases that are existing, but in order to actually provide new lots, they have to be buildable per the code.
Mr. Stolzenberg.
Yeah, I think Carl made a lot of good points. The one about blank walls is interesting. You know, most uses don't involve locking yourself inside a building with no light coming in at all, except movie theaters and maybe like laser tag. So that's, I wonder if maybe just an exception for those types of uses. I don't know.
Grocery stores too, I mean,
Yeah, but you could have light in grocery stores. I don't know. So I'm sure you guys all read my notes and agreed with everything.
We all agreed that you wrote them.
Rory, I agreed with 99.9% of what you wrote.
Oh, well, I guess
That
we'll see
counts
what
for
the
anything.
point one is. Outdoor amenity spaces, I mean, Carl talked about this a lot. I just don't see the public good in providing private amenity spaces. I think rooftop decks are awesome. I have one myself, though it's not communal, so it wouldn't count. They're great. I don't see the public good. And that said, I can see how the other ones sort of fall apart. I didn't go as strongly as Carl of saying get rid of all amenity space requirements, but maybe that is the right thing to do. I need to think about that more also with the block requirements in Module 2. I did want to talk about lodging. Surprised Commissioner Russell didn't bring this up. So beyond homestays, which I think are mostly a carry forward from existing code, except for the pets thing, and I do feel like renters should be allowed to do them. Lodging by right in RB and RC, I wanted to make sure everyone noticed that was there. So it's like saying B and B type places would be by right in RB and RC. And I do feel like that means it's pretty likely that we'll get a lot of Airbnb conversions in RB and RC. And so I think making those something like a special use permit, since we get the idea of doing it along corridors, but I don't think we want to see mass conversions of these whole corridors, which I think is plausible. I think that would be a healthier middle ground. Let's see, I said a bunch of random uses. Those weren't very controversial. I guess we'll talk about side setbacks. So I guess I'll preface this by saying, like, if I were to say eliminate requirements for side setbacks, everyone in the community, I'm sure, would say, oh my God, Rory wants to build, this apartment building next door to me right up to my lot line. And I think that is a reasonable concern, and that it's specifically your lot line that you worry about, right? Like, I don't care about someone's side lot line that lives 5 blocks from me. I care about the house next to me not being immediately up to the lot line, unless I'm okay with it, or I'm given some incentive to be okay with it. And so I think there are a lot of benefits to having buildings that go up to the lot line. one in the handy diagram I sent you all, which I'm sure you looked at. When they're not the lot line, you have space for windows on the side. The building needs to be thinner and deeper into the lot. And so you have less usable open space. You have this like sliver of unusable side yard, and you have a bunch of windows pointing and looking out at your neighbors. But if you build to the lot line, you can make the whole building a lot more compact and square. You force the views to be front and back onto the street for that safety element. And you're just making a better use of space. There's more space for trees. There's more space for recreation. I personally, if I had to choose between either of those two on the lot next door to me, I would pick the one that doesn't have all the windows looking out next to me and what seems like a giant building because it protrudes halfway into the backyard. So some mechanism to make that happen. I understand it's probably not completely legal to say the neighbor gets to decide whether you do it or not. But if it can be a discretionary review process that takes that into account along with other factors, but mostly that James can think about and be like, well, if the neighbor's okay with it and also it has other public benefits, then sure. I think that would be good. Does anyone hate it?
Responses to that?
I don't love it.
I think it's, if the neighbor's okay with it, I don't think it's a problem.
Just,
I don't think that's
just,
how we.
ju- well, just to be, just to elaborate on the point on that, on the legality of that. So the zoning enabling legislation gives authority to local governments to do zoning, right? And particularly invests that power with the city council and then planning commission and staff to make decisions under that, right? State law doesn't allow us to then vest that decision down to the neighbor.
Sure, and like I said, I'm not directly suggesting they get absolute authority over this. I'm suggesting creating a waiver process where things like public input, like the input of the neighbor, is taken into account just like it would be with every other waiver process.
But really with waiver, special exceptions, special use permits, what we look to is a set of standards. And those standards aren't that the neighborhood likes.
Typically, a standard is like negative effect on neighbors, right?
But not that the neighbor likes it.
Well, if the
Or
neighbor
is
doesn't
okay
think
with
it's
it.
bad, then it's not an adverse effect on them. I figure you guys will work the legal part out if people like the idea.
Rory, let me add, there actually is some legal precedent for that. There are a lot of subdivision restrictions that say if you're going to do something that may violate these restrictions, the neighbors have 30 days to object. And if the neighbors don't object within 30 days, they lose those rights. Now, whether that would be transferable in some way to the city, I don't know, but there's at least some authority for neighbors having some sort of veto.
Is that in contract law?
It's certainly a matter of contract law, yes, but I imagine if somebody thought about it, they might say, maybe we can figure out a way to draw the analogy.
Thank you.
I figured my hope would be that the commission and council would say broadly this makes sense, and that you guys could work with the lawyers and figure out if there's a way to go about it.
This was the 0.1% for me. Sorry.
Please.
No, I'm just saying I disagree. I don't, for the RA districts, that seems really complicated.
Am I correct that a rezoning could be a different way to achieve the same end?
I mean, right now you'd have to rezone to RX or higher, right? I mean, I guess if you allowed it in RB and RC, if you allowed 0 side setbacks in RB and RC, then you could rezone to RB. But otherwise, you have to rezone to RX3, which is a much more intense zone.
Is it you? I don't think it's me.
So, yeah, I mean, I don't hate the idea of going to zero side in RB and RC like Carl's suggesting, but I think but then I think, you know, the neighbor in RB is going to be like, what the hell? Someone's building up to my lot line. And I think this is a more balanced and fair way of going about the change. The other thing I really like about it is that it incentivizes, I mean, of course, the discretion in my amateur legal analysis would probably end up with the NDS director, but if they were to weight the opinion of the neighbor, creates a good incentive for the developer to work with the neighbor directly and come to a mutually beneficial outcome. And, you know, like whether that involves, you know, design input or concessions or a direct payment to the neighbor, I don't know, but it gets to a place where the neighbor is happy about this thing going in next to him.
I'll just share my perspective right now, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this, but I'm happy to think and talk about it more over email. But I guess my initial thought is I feel like it's one of these things that is internally coherent and makes sense on paper, but I'm not sure what it looks like on the implementation side in terms of like city staff realistically, and I don't know if it's worth that complication, but that's just my initial thought.
Right. And I thought one of the reasons we went through this is to make the whole zoning thing a little bit easier for everyone to comprehend. But if you can write it up to make it simple, understandable, but that was another purpose of going through this process, that a lot of things wasn't.
Yeah, I think I think you might have an exact inverse effect or an opposite effect, which is, you know, Stolzenberg Construction buys the lot next door to me and wants to do a zero lot line, and I say no, and you say please, and I say no, and then you say I will deliver this new Maserati to you tomorrow afternoon, you know, driven by a lingerie model, and I still say no. And then you get kind of pissed off at me because I've said no, and you go about building something else on that lot that's going to annoy me even more, particularly if you start with your backhoe at 7:01 a.m. every morning for the next. Yeah, I think it just sort of adds an opportunity for conflict as opposed to smoothing over one. You know, it puts you in a difficult position. Anyway.
Mr. Stolzenberg, do you have anything more for us?
No, I mean, I guess I'd endorse Carl's simpler solution then.
Duly noted. Mr. Palmer, Module 1, what do you have for us?
I don't think I have any comments right now. Thanks.
Very well. If something comes to you, please let me know.
I will.
As for me, you got my email. I was thinking about geometry. That was the only thing in math class I was any good at. In general, my understanding is that pedestrian-friendly design means narrow lots that people can get through a lot. It creates visual diversity, just makes it more walkable, more interesting place. And thankfully, we have a lot of places like that in Charlottesville. We're pretty good at that, at least in the older parts of the city. And I think that's, if we can, to the extent that we can support that in the code, I think that's going to be a win for us, for affordability, for design quality, for walkability. It just seems very successful. I sent an email with a long list of mixed-use buildings or commercial buildings that are sort of neighborhood scale that are all have front access, but generally either an alley access or a shared right-of-way between two owners. And they're all narrow, and they seem to work well, all with parking behind. So I think this is a model that we've seen succeed in Charlottesville, and something I think we can incorporate into the code successfully. Though how you do that, I'm very interested to see. Rear setbacks, this just occurred to me as we were into the conversation. Do rear setbacks know about alleys? Do they change if there are alleys? Mm-hmm. They do. Okay, I'm getting nods from Carl.
I think there's an alley setback.
That is more generous, I assume?
The same as rear. It's rear/alley.
I think it's always like 4 feet or something. I think.
It depends from the in the R district. So R, A, B, and C, they are the same. So there's side/rear alley, and that's because we're requiring 4 feet back there. But when you move into the instances where we have a 0 foot rear setback, if there's an alley, we increase that a bit to provide right-of-way room for that alley to exist.
My suggestion, if possible, would be to be more generous with alley space, because there's less opportunity for nuisance with an alley. It is itself a buffer between those properties. Shared open space requirements. What I think you're trying to do here, and I hope you're trying to do here, is my favorite things in the world, which are courtyard apartments and courtyard cottages. Am I reading you correctly? Is that the idea?
Yes, so these are meant to be places that are actually amenitized as opposed to just blank front setbacks that are, I mean, maybe grass and people can sit on, but aren't really particularly designed for actual public open space. So we are providing an incentive where you're actually get to count that square footage double whenever you're doing an amenitized pedestrian open space for things like courtyard apartments. And we're also including that towards your build to requirement. So because it is an active space, and that's really what we're intending for the build to requirement, it counts as if it were a building. So we're trying to use that to really incentivize those pedestrian oriented, more sort of urban and well-designed plazas, courtyards, things like that, even patio seating.
Can you help me understand how that incentive works?
Yeah, a couple different ways. So if you dig into the outdoor amenity space requirements, you'll see in there that, we have a 10% of your lot area is required. If it is adjacent to the public right of way, so if it's adjacent to your sidewalk, then that square footage counts double. So if you provided all of your required outdoor amenity space, it would only add up to 5% of your lot that you're having to provide because that counts double. And then also because we want you to put that next to your sidewalk, and that means that maybe your building can't be in that part, then, on particularly corner lots, or if you think of a courtyard apartment that's sort of a U shape, it would require a developer to sort of carve out the middle of that U-shaped apartment. That gets to count towards your build to requirement. So it means that you can have, and functionally that's cheaper to build, right? You're not putting a building there, but you are putting a landscape pedestrian plaza. So those are the primary incentives that we have built in.
Mr. Schwartz, does that math make sense to you?
No, it makes sense. And I think the idea of using these outdoor amenity spaces, right? You had a whole section how you're supposed to design them and things that should go into them. I think that all makes sense. It just seemed to use it as a way to modulate the mass of the building makes sense to me. To use it as a way to say the residents need to have an amenity space that's within the building or on the property doesn't make sense to me. So that was kind of my point.
So is your concern more about the rooftop allowance?
My concern is more that when you require an amenity space, it is never functional. It's never useful. The city should be focusing instead on its own parks and on the county has requirements for half court basketball court and a top lot with 2 pieces of equipment, things like that. I forget what the city has, and I know your requirements don't go into those sort of details, but these amenity spaces are never they're not usable by the tenants of the building. They're kind of substandard. They're just there because they meet zoning code. Or it seems like it's much more of a useful tool, as you're saying, if it's something to carve out the building. So I'd prefer to see this rewritten in a way that it's used as a massing tool versus this is a place that the residents of the building need to be able to use. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I understand the concern, and that's part of the reason that we use that requirement, and we build in those sort of pre-prescribed design standards, and we require them to be a certain size and certain width. So it is trying to get at that usability. We want it to be meaningful space, not just a sort of little sad courtyard that nobody goes into. There's transparency requirements, so we're treating the facade around that as if it were against the street, because we want it to be tied in with that sort of private to public realm, that progression. There's some planning requirements planting requirements. So getting some of that landscaping and trees in there, which I know is of importance. And it is also an incentive, now that you mentioned the building massing. Whenever we talk about building width, we do build in an amenity space. We call it, I think it's an outdoor amenity space building break alternative. Language like that off the top of my head. It is an alternative where you can have the same building, and it essentially, if you insert a plaza within that building, it counts as a new building width. You can start that calculation over if you insert a plaza or a courtyard to break up that massing.
That's why I think all those things are useful, and I think that's why that section should be kept. It's just the way that it's, instead of being, you know, required as an amenity space, it's a tool for mass. That was explained my just bile asked.
So I think there's also a question of where they're applied, right? Like they're required in RB and RC. So let me ask a question. If I have a single family house on a 5,000 square foot lot in RB, so there's a 500 square foot amenity space requirement. Do I have to put one of these amenity spaces on my property?
Wait, as an existing single-family house?
Let's say I'm building a new single-family house.
All right, new construction.
So in a new construction, you would have to build something that would essentially just be your backyard. That can qualify as your outdoor amenity space because it's used by the occupants of that building.
Okay. Mr. Payne. Module 1.
Well, I won't be as in the weeds as this past conversation. I mean, my thoughts at a higher level, which may still overlap with some mapping issues, which I know we didn't want to get into tonight.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess the first one that comes to mind is that the Housing Advisory Committee has done a little bit of work looking at density, setbacks, other issues, and the impact that could have on affordability. I won't get into the weeds on those, but I think that would be worth a serious discussion and consideration of what the HAC has been putting forward there, and some of that will bleed into Module 2 in terms of their concerns about sensitive areas, as well as if there's any potential in terms of tax abatement and that incentivizing further affordable housing construction, which I understand there's really no analysis or plan to do analysis about whether tax abatement is a strategy that makes sense to pair with zoning changes in any way. On Module 1, I guess one of the things I'm still unsure about is I understand the mapping logic that there is in terms of these nodes that jump up specifically, particularly in the mixed-use commercial districts. I understand how we got there, but when I look at the map, some of them just appear really arbitrary to me in terms of in practice. And I don't know. I mean, like,
I was just going to ask, arbitrary how? In terms of the, like, why this location, this particular location doesn't make extent, or the extent, like the size of that particular location appears arbitrary?
I mean, some of the locations that are, for example, just like an example, it's not arbitrary in the sense that I understand how on the mapping logic that is outlined how we ended up there.
Yeah.
But in terms of like actual on the ground practice, it seems kind of arbitrary to me. Where you'll have like one or two single parcels that have jumped up significantly in height, and then everything around them wasn't. Or an area like the intersection of East High and Mead, you have it jump up to NX8. And I understand how you ended up there at the intersection of Long Street and Pantops. But I don't understand how that intersection, how like on the ground, logically, that makes any sense. And I understand both because it's all single family height and density around there currently, and the infrastructure doesn't make any sense for that level of intensity. And I understand development comes before investment in infrastructure. It doesn't make any sense to say, no change will happen until there's infrastructure. But that's just one example. Like, there's a couple other areas that popped up where, like, I wasn't really getting how it made a lot of sense in practice. I haven't had a chance to read through them. Maybe the transitions in Module 2 will, address some of those concerns. The other one I've talked about, which is really more Module 2, is specific. When it comes to residential, I think my only real major concern is areas that have been missed in sensitive communities that, again, have that risk of displacement, which is more Module 2. Module 1, the other thing is just how do the zoning changes align with existing plans? For example, resident-led redevelopment of West Haven Friendship Court. We've talked about Crescent Halls and how the zoning may not have been aligned with some of the future plans there. I think it's under the existing zoning, the Friendship Court will be overshadowed by 12-story buildings. That's a policy choice, but I know that's not in alignment with kind of the resident designers' plans. That's a tension, but it's one that I feel like we haven't really discussed or dove into. Similarly, like Cherry Avenue small area plan, I actually see how the zoning map kind of aligns with that plan. But there's some others, like Star Hill small area plan. Maybe we've just abandoned that guiding anything. But how does zoning map changes align with that, and the urban Rivanna River corridor plan, which I know, whole different world, but it called for even a new zoning district along the Rivanna, and at least to have zoning that matches a plan along the entire Rivanna that's in the city to kind of guide the future of development there, which I don't think our current zoning map reflects in any way. And that plan wasn't calling for no development, but I think calling for something that's more intentional, like Asheville's River Arts District, where you've done some intentional planning around that area, created more of like a greenway space. So I don't see that reflected in it. And the final thing, it's kind of related to the arbitrariness, or at least my perceived arbitrariness of how high the heights go in some of the mixed-use nodes. But it's a whole nother can of worms, but we've discussed residential understandably, but I feel like we haven't really discussed as much the mixed-use commercial districts. And there may be something I'm missing, and it may be that the transitions in Module 2 will address some of these concerns. But I feel like, some of these districts, in terms of mixed-use commercial, you're jumping up like 2-3 times in height. Maybe that's the direction we want to go, but you think of an area like Carytown in Richmond. Part of the planning they've done is to have a mixed-use commercial district, which was more of a human scale height, which makes it a unique district. And we have some of that. Obviously, the downtown mall, it's a whole nother thing. But we have some other mixed-use commercial districts, I feel like along East High, downtown Belmont, to some extent Preston, that are kind of been that direction. And our zoning change to allow, 10 and in some cases 12-story of height is going to abandon that being the structure of commercial development. And again, maybe that's the direction, we want to go, but one of the things I just wonder about is when you're increasing, I don't have a good sense of what the incentives will actually be for them to be mixed-use development and not 100% commercial. I may just be missing and not understanding it, but I'm unsure about that. And when you go up that much in scale, I just wonder whether you're going to have different institutional developers and investors who are going to purchase those parcels, and you're going to see a structure of commercial development that looks much more like an office park or something, rather than, again, a human-scaled mixed-use commercial district like I think a lot of people envision. I don't know if we're kind of getting there. Maybe that's not the shared vision for the mixed-use commercial districts, and if it is, I'm not sure we're getting there. But
James, do you want me to take that, or do you want to start?
Do you want to respond to some of that, and then I can pick up as well?
I think to provide just some context on the mapping, with the first draft, we fully recognize that there are a handful and perhaps more than a handful of areas that, considering the existing context, maybe don't make a lot of sense. But what we wanted to do in the first round is have a really high level of rigor in applying essentially a one-to-one of here's the comprehensive plan, here's the land use associated with it, and here's how we want to funnel those into these various zoning categories so that we as the planning consultants weren't making those judgment calls. So we wanted to put, that's the version of the map that you have now, and it really was setting up the framework so that we could have the conversations that about these areas that you're pointing out, and have those conversations more communally rather than us picking and sort of deciding off the bat which of those areas need to be looked at a bit deeper. And I think that does include the small area plans that should continue to move forward, and I don't want to say override the comprehensive plan, but should be taken into consideration in conjunction with it. And in areas maybe where the small area plans are too out of date and aren't really aligned with current policy. So that's part of the conversation that we certainly want to dig into with mapping. And hopefully that gives a bit of context for what we were thinking. It was sort of a step one. Here's really just an initial conversion with a level of rigor without any of our judgment calls being overlaid on top of that. I don't know if there's any other piece, James, that you wanted me to speak to.
Well, I guess what you could add in is one of the things referenced is about the issue of I'm going to call it human scale amenities in those commercial corridors, and how this the ordinance is proposing to accomplish those. Can you speak to that just high level a little bit?
Yeah, that really gets into, a lot of what we are thinking about and controlling with the standards is dealing with that ground story. There are a couple ways that we can add additional requirements on top of what you currently have to get at that human scale development pattern. One thing that we are already talking about and figuring out for downtown is not a setback, but a step back, which is essentially stepping back the massing. It still allows for the same number of stories in height, but it's stepping back the massing after a certain number of stories. Usually it's around 3 stories, and then that massing gets stepped back, 20 to 30 feet, and the height would continue on from there. And that is one tool that we have that communities want to see along certain corridors. It doesn't have to be everywhere that tool is applied. Maybe at certain areas that it makes more sense than others. And it's not something that we have currently proposed, but it's a tool that we very easily could add in if that's something that, particularly when you're getting above 5 stories, if it feels like it may be out of context, and there still wants to be an allowance for that level of height, but figuring out a way to make it more contextual, that street step back is a way that we can achieve that. And in module 2, there are requirements in there for the transition sort of on the back of the property where it would be a lower intensity district. So that helps sort of on the back and those shared property lines. But that street step back tool is another thing that we can evaluate for certain areas or certain districts, certainly.
Yeah, and I think that gets at some of it. And once I read through module 2, get better sense of kind of the transitions and how that affects the human scale. But I mean, that gets at kind of what my concern is. I guess to kind of distill it down, you've got an area like Preston. You've had a development there recently, like the Dairy Central building, which had many different thoughts from the 10th and Page neighborhood. And in this plan, you're doubling the height of that building along that entire corridor. And I don't know. I mean, I wonder if that's something we just need to approach with a little bit more humility than we have in terms of how that's going to play out in those mixed-use districts. But
And I will add that the heights we really did, sort of similar to the mapping, we really took those straight from the comprehensive plan. And we gave it a few more flavors. So, in the corridor areas, for example, that went up to 5, 8, 10 stories in some instances. And so we tried to apply those flavors where we thought it made sense, but it's very possible and probable that we misapplied some of those. and maybe, you know, there's a flavor of a district that doesn't exist that needs to, that we don't currently have sort of in your toolbox. So it's an observation that we are looking for more feedback on. So I encourage you to continue picking out those places and pointing to us where we may need something different to evaluate that area.
Mayor Snook.
So, excuse me. I am decidedly not getting into the weeds with you all, but I've spent a lot of time recently discussing with constituents the broad issues here. And one thing that struck me is that folks, I'll be a little bit overly classifying here, folks on the right and folks on the left have the same basic concern. When it comes right down to it, they don't know what is going to work, and they don't know whether any of this is going to work. And they are so concerned on one side that it will work, and on one side that it won't work, that the debate intensifies over that uncertainty. So that, for example, for the folks who are in the current R1 neighborhoods, the prospect of having 4 or 8 people, 4 or 8 units on a present R1/RA lot. The fact that you'd get to 8 is a problem. In an RB, you get to 12. And on the other hand, folks on what I'll term the left of this debate will say, well, of course, that's the whole purpose. And the problem is that, as I've done the math and I've checked with a number of other folks, the way this proposal is set forth can't possibly work, because the construction costs are always going to exceed the rent that is available. And the only way that it makes sense is if the city is going to be subsidizing each individual transaction, each individual 8-plex or each individual 12-plex. And that gets to the point that I think was made earlier tonight, which is that basically there's no way this is going to be an option for anybody other than PHA or CRHA or Habitat. It's and when the original concept was being floated, it was with the idea, number one, as Mr. Freeze noted early on, it was with the idea that what was going to be built was going to be house-sized, that it was going to feel like the house, that would like a house in the neighborhood. And while it might be, say, 50% larger, it wasn't going to be 300% larger. And so, particularly for folks in the single-family neighborhoods right now, they really feel like this, the terms they would use are bait and switch. That they were promised, and I will tell you, as one who tried to sell people on the future land use map 2 years ago, I believed what I was being told. I believed that we were going to end up with basically a form-based code-ish kind of development scheme here, where the places that were being built in the current single-family neighborhoods were going to look and feel kind of like what we have now. And clearly that is not the way this is moving. And clearly we are, it's just not. And so if we're going to end up by saying that what we're really expecting is a few duplexes, a few townhouses here and there, and then every couple of blocks maybe a 12-unit apartment complex, what we end up with are a bunch of sore thumbs sticking up. That it will have destroyed the character of the neighborhood, or at least the consistency of the neighborhood, or if you wanted, the term homogeneity was used earlier. And maybe that's a goal, to destroy those neighborhoods. I suspect it's not. I suspect nobody would articulate it that way. But that's probably what you're going to end up with, because it's not going to be possible unless PHA or somebody else is able to get the capital and the funding to put it all together, which is probably going to require a subsidy from the city at $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 per unit. And if we're really serious about getting to 3,000 affordable units built, that effectively means we're looking at $150 million worth of city money. And we don't have $150 million worth of city money, which leads to the broader question, I guess, is what is our, do we have a goal, a numeric goal, a point where we would say, if we hit this marker, we know we have done what we intended to do? Or is it simply, we've got to keep building however many units we can, knowing that we will never solve with mathematical precision what that equation really comes out to be? I ask the question because when we start looking at the specifics, and I'm just mentioning some of the specifics that seem to get people particularly concerned, I'm wondering whether the specifics, like cutting the lot size down to 2,500 square feet in some districts, like the maximum coverage, lot coverage kinds of numbers, like eliminating parking requirements. These are all things that the metaphor was used last fall that what the consultants were going to do is to give us like a control panel with 5 or 6 different knobs, and all of them could be turned to up to 3 or to 5 or to 10, or if you're a movie fan, turn it up to 11. But that the idea would be that we could turn some of them back if things seem to be going too fast. We could turn something up if it would seem to be going too slow. And the sense that I'm getting is that we are committing ourselves more and more to turning all of them up to 10 to start. Now, again, maybe that's the goal, and maybe the problem is that we don't have a way of understanding when fast enough has come. How fast do we want to be doing what? I've looked at the rate of expected change analysis in some detail, and the first question, I had sent a number of these questions to Mr. Freeze, and some of them he answered, and some of them I think we're going to be consulting with the consultants to ask. But one of the first questions I had that gets to this rate of change is, I can't tell from the rate of expected change analysis whether they are expecting an annual increase of 431 units, or whether 431 units is the number intended over a 5-year period, which is what the page kind of references. But obviously it makes a huge difference, because if you're talking about a rate of change analysis that is going to produce 400 new units a year, now we're at 2,000 units in 5 years, and gee, suddenly we start thinking we're solving this problem. I strongly suspect that's not what it means. And I think if we need to know, that's one of those questions that we kind of need to know. There are a whole lot of pieces of the analysis, or the various sort of promises that we had been made, or arguments that had been made to us, that I feel personally responsible for because I repeated them to constituents when people talked about the metaphor of the radio control, the volume control, and that we weren't going to start with everything turned up to a maximum level. Or when I talk about the form-based code aspect of things, because that is absolutely what we were telling people we should tell people 2 years ago. And that's what I did tell people, and now people are quite rightly coming to me and saying, what the hell? This is not what you were talking about at all. And the best way to try to figure out whether we are really planning, or rather we're simply throwing everything at the wall and hoping that some of it works, would be, the questions I've got in the rate of change analysis is whether that analysis is finely tuned enough to tell us whether any of these particular changes have any particular expected results. It may be that it's not a fine enough tool, and that's fine. Let's be honest about it, if that's what the situation is. So I feel a broad sense of frustration that that the debate has gone in a direction that is, I think, not sustainable, but we don't know. And I wonder what we can do to find out, to get some of these numbers, to know whether we're headed in the right direction, or whether we're going overboard, or whether we're not going far enough, or just what. That's my overall comment on things. That I would add that a number of people on both sides of the debate have asked that we look at the example of Arlington. And I've heard comments about Arlington from time to time and the process that they're involved in the middle of. And I would love to have our folks, not just the commenters from either wing, I'd love to have our team here give us a sense of whether they think that the Arlington proposals make sense, whether it's something we ought to emulate, or whether it's something we ought to run from. Those are my broad comments, and I don't know whether there's anything that anybody wants to comment on in particular, but I just want to throw it out there.
Looking at you, Mr. Freeze.
I'm sorry.
Looking at you, sir.
Okay.
And some of it, you answered some
yeah,
of my questions in ways that I found very helpful, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you looking at me to speak broadly to the policy direction? I mean, I think what we have started from is attempting to accomplish the things I think that Mayor Snook is talking about. We started from the idea of introducing a code that looked at the issues of house scale and looked at compatibility with the existing neighborhoods. And I stand by this notion of dialing up, dialing down. I think that's a very good analogy. I don't think in our proposal we've dialed it up. I think a lot of the conversation, and maybe this is what you're referring to, has been talking about how we dial up further from where it is. But we're not trying to start at a dialed up standpoint. And I do think the code provisions we're proposing, particularly in the RA, RB, and RC, but across all of it, are attempting to look at, are attempting to address these issues of scale and compatibility. As far as the Arlington code, I've been tracking it very, very closely. And technically they are done. They're no longer in the middle of their conversation because they voted and adopted their proposal last week. Their proposal is more aggressive than ours, on the one hand, in terms of the base allowance. But I think that's appropriate to their market, not necessarily appropriate to ours. But they're allowing 6 units on every lot within the county. On the other hand, when they got to the point of adopting, in the course of that adoption, they put an annual cap on how many units can be built per zoning district. And that's certainly, as long as that's legal, and I haven't heard an argument that says it's not, and they did it. That's something that you guys may want to consider as well. So they, rather than trying to moderate what the zoning allows, they put an annual cap on how many units could be developed for a 5-year period.
Just without having to put one on there, how many, and I know it was an unusual year, how many building permits did NDS issue in 2022?
I don't know the number off the top of my head. And I know 2020, I know the dollar figure because I've been working on budgets, but that doesn't tell you how many units.
All right, well, what's a reasonable capacity for NDS to issue building permits now that you've got approaching the appropriate number of bodies, et cetera?
We're more than approaching. We're fully staffed in building permits, and I'm actually not concerned about our capacity to issue building permits. I mean, I think.
Well, what I'm suggesting is that, if we're talking about thousands of units, can you issue 1,000 building permits in 1 year with this new?
Yeah,
that's reasonable.
But I think that's not going to be the governor of the governor of how many units get built isn't governed by how many permits we can issue. It's governed by what the demand is.
Well, I mean, I was thinking in terms of these larger, 3 and 4 unit buildings. Do they meet? Do they match? I think initially people are trying to figure out what the hell they're going to do. Too. I mean, it's a lot of. So I was suggesting that there would be a natural throughput restriction. You're saying there really wouldn't be.
No, I think the restriction is going to be on. I think initially we may initially see an uptick because I think there's a lot of projects kind of waiting in the wings that are either already in the planning stages and are planning on going forward under the existing zoning ordinance or under the new one, But they're anticipating a discretionary process in the existing zoning ordinance. And then it'll level out from there, but it's all going to be based on, the critical factors are going to be demand and the availability of land and lots. And we know the greater, both of those are significant restrictions, right? The answer on the question of the market analysis, right? The rate of change analysis. So it says 430 units. It's meant to say 430 units per year, but why I didn't answer your question right away is I don't know whether they meant 5 years or 3 years, because in the conversations I've had with them, they said we are reluctant to predict beyond 3 years because there's so many variables at play. But then they reference 5 years on that page, and so even I have a bit of confusion and want to get some clarity on that point.
So your sense is that it is intended to be the 430 new units per year?
Per year.
Whether it's for 3 years or 5 years
Right.
remains to be seen, but that's the figure we're
Yeah.
talking at least 1,300 units in the next 3 years.
Well, so
supposedly.
there's a caveat in the report, right? Like that's.
Yes, that's what I was about to get to. It's kind of a
Theoretical
major, several major caveats in the report, one of which is that's a supply side analysis, which basically says theoretically, you could produce this many units. There's the lots come up for sale on a regular enough rate, and there's enough lots that potentially could accommodate this without digging into the details of those lots, that you could produce that number. But that's not a prediction of the demand. And that's the other side of it. The demand figure is a much more difficult figure to come to.
My sense is that the demand, I can't tell you whether it's for 400 units a year, but it's higher than our current ability to produce.
And that is true.
And the other thing I wanted to add is when I talk to developer folks, they tell me that one of the constraints that they've been working under, and they still believe it to be a problem, is getting permits and getting inspections. And maybe you're getting very close to having solved the problem, and maybe they're giving me old news, but they're giving it to me right now, so they currently feel it.
They're feeling it, and I shouldn't speak for them broadly, but where our data is on building permits, we're turning around the vast majority of those. More than 90% of the building permits we're receiving now are being turned around in about 2 weeks. And
Well,
we're
okay.
scheduling inspections next day, but what you're referring to are site plans.
Yeah,
And
that's
I will
true.
readily admit that we have a lot of work to do on moving the site plan review process.
And 12 plexes and so on would involve site plans.
They would, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. But I wanted to be clear about that distinction. Just because if I go back 1 year, building permits were 80 to 90 days to get your permit.
Right.
So I want to celebrate the successes
Yes.
that we've got.
Lots of progress there.
Yeah.
So Lloyd, I'm having a little difficulty keeping up with you. My intellectual throughput is not quite as big as yours. So what exactly is frustrating you about where we are in this very moment, as relates to where you thought we'd be 2 years ago when you guys voted to approve the FLOM?
Your question is more process oriented than I'm thinking. My question is, my issue is that every time I get a new round of emails from all of you all, it's another way to turn the knob up more. But we don't know what kind of action we're going to get out of the knobs we've already turned. And we don't know whether we're going way overboard or whether we're not going far enough. And that's why my question was whether we have any way of guesstimating even whether, just as an example, whether the lot size thing is going to matter in RB and RC. If we're cutting back 2,500 square feet, that's one issue with it I don't understand well enough to be able to discuss the subtleties of. But I will also tell you that in talking with people who are reading the plan and trying to make sense of it, when they look at the notion that, for example, my neighbor down the street who's going to be an RB can divide his lot into 6 lots. And each lot, as I understand it, is not limited to 1 unit, but rather could in theory be 12 units. And you start talking to people and they're saying 6 times 12 is 72 units, and what the heck? I doubt that you could ever build 72 units on that parcel. But if you start, part of my overall concern is that we have gotten ourselves into a position where we're ending up with an increasingly divided community over this, but a lot of what they are divided over, I think, is illusory. I don't think it will actually work either as well or as poorly as either side thinks, which is why I'm prefacing my overall question in terms of, do we have any way of knowing, or even have a vague guess as to how any of these things is actually going to work, is actually going to affect the market? Because it is certainly possible to come up with sort of scary thoughts of how many units could be built, and certainly I've been getting emails about people on Grove Road who write to me and they say, thank you, my microphone seems to be doing funky things. People on Grove Road who write to me and say, well, there are 45 houses on Grove Road, each one of which would be large enough that we could actually have 300 separate units on Grove Road, 300 separate lots on Grove Road, given the size of those properties. And then they start talking about 300 units or 300 lots and how many units per lot, and we get the same sort of question. And I don't know what to be able to tell them. I don't know what's reasonable. I don't know whether whether it would be possible to say we're looking at the 431 units, and yes, how many of them are going to go on Grove Road, and how does this figure? I'm just wondering if we have any way of knowing what these what the effects of any individual proposal is going to be.
So your frustration is with the vagaries of what the outcome's going to be. We don't know what tomorrow's going to look like. It's just too vague based on the data we've got today and where we are.
Well, that is a frustration. The other frustration I've got is the very distinct and admitted change in the rhetoric about what we proposed 2 years ago, and what we proposed 2 years ago with house-sized developments in RB, or we didn't have RB at the time, but house-sized developments in the more intense uses. That's not what we're going to be ending up with.
I think it's
Why do you
still
say that?
3 floors with a bonus, and the base is 2.5 floors in the RB. So I think in a way we're still using the form-based code to try to make it match that neighborhood scale. But when people look at density, I think they kind of like step back from that. But really, you can only achieve so much if you subdivide your lot into this narrow lot with one frontage on the road. You can't get that maximum within the confines of what the height requirements that we're setting on that lot are.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, in addition to height, when you're talking about house size, you're talking about the dimensions of the house, right? And so I'm looking at this random lot I picked on Grove Road, 1448. The house is 60 feet wide, its frontage, right? The maximum width we're allowing in our massing is 40 feet. So actually, that house is 50% larger than the width of a apartment building or fourplex or single-family house that we'd be allowing in RB under these rules. I think in a lot of ways the massing is reduced from what's currently allowed. And similarly, if you just look at if the lot size requirements, you can divide a very big lot by that amount. But if you're not looking at the frontage requirements, that's the real restriction on most lots of how you can subdivide it.
So would you agree that you would not, in fact, want to have a 12-plex on that lot?
Well, if it's RB, you would have
It
to.
would be.
It has to be affordable.
Right.
And personally, I think it does make sense to have massing bonuses as part of that bonus. But no, I mean, I think you could fit a 12-plex within a 40-foot width, like within the massing we're specifying here. It's going to restrict probably the size of your units, but I mean, you know, if it's 3 stories, that's 4 per floor. You know, I think that's very viable for 20 feet wide for a unit.
And the
Why not?
neighbors, and the neighbors, and the neighbors, and the neighbors. And what they're,
But that presumes that there's going to be an enormous turnover very rapidly in one area, which there are genuine concerns about that Michael brought up earlier, particularly in these sensitive areas, particularly when you've got out-of-town landlords are like, hey, that's a ridiculous amount of money, I'll take that. You know, I just got the plumbing repair bill for this Quest piping. I'm more than happy to do this, or whatever. But that, I think, presumes a really aggressive turnover in these neighborhoods that there's only so much that becomes available. Theoretically, we could get to 431 in theory, but most of those are going to be bought and sold for the same use.
And remember, 430 is number of units, not
Right,
number of lots.
not
The
number of transactions.
Number of transactions is, I think, 130, somewhere in that vicinity. I can't remember the number.
188,
I'm sorry?
188.
188, thank you.
So, you know, I mean, I can't imagine in these former R1/RA districts that the majority of the turnover is going to be for the purposes of implementing a higher unit count. It's going to be somebody buying a house.
And in Greenbrier in particular, it has the highest percentage of owner occupancy for medium. 91.4% of Greenbrier's medium intensity lots are owner occupied. And so you would expect that to slow that turnover further because people who are there raising a family are less likely to turn over in a given year than maybe a landlord who would have a financial incentive that outweighs that, you know, financial or just having roots incentive to stick around for a while.
So at that point, you get the sore thumb approach, where you get nothing, sore thumb, 4 stories, whatever it is going to be.
But there is no 4 stories.
12-plex, whatever you want to, however you want to view it in terms of what could actually be built there. I mean, I question, and I don't know the details of the height requirements and so on, and I don't know where the bonuses kick in for what, but what folks who live in that area are concerned about, and I will freely admit that I am not expert enough to rebut their concerns, is this notion, again, getting back to the question of both sides operating from a position of they don't really know what's going to work. And we don't know, apparently, all we're saying is, well, it's probably not going to work the way people fear that it's going to work, and it's probably not going to work the way the proponents of it want it to work. And I'm just wondering if there is any way we can get any greater degree of certainty other than we're throwing it all at the wall, we're going to see what works. And 5 years and 10 years from now, we'll try to make some sense out of what we've just done.
So Lloyd, I know we have to end here because I thought we had a hard stop at
Oh,
7,
sorry.
7:45. So
8.
I've also heard that.
was 8:45?
No, 8 o'clock.
What?
We got an email saying we had a hard stop at 7:45.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know
It's
that.
really 8, okay.
Yeah, so I just want, I said that I think that's where I am, Lord. Some of the questions that, we had some great comments. I have received a lot of comments on both ends, from the HAC and the Low Income Housing Coalition, and from residents. They just don't know, and I think, just with anything, with the fear of the unknown, you will, a lot of looking at the worst case scenarios. And I think that as we go through this process and we try to, answer those questions, and I'm still
compiling my comments. So that's kind of, where, those just kind of some general comments at this point. I think, Lord, you kind of summarized a lot of the, kind of where I am on this. It's like, I wasn't part of the original, debate over this, because I wasn't on council. I thought I could use my planning background from UVA to help with this, but this is going to be straight up politics with this, I believe so. This is good discussion, but I think when it comes to council, a lot of it's going to be politics, what we think is best for this city to address. I was walking with a constituent today through several neighborhoods. We started at the free speech wall and just kind of meandered through just talking about another issue, but you can see the changes in, Star Hill, Fifield, and other neighborhoods where they're just, house is small at the beginning as it is, and just blowing up in the back. It's huge, and you can see the changes, all throughout the city. And I know that, one of the neighborhoods we were walking through was Fifield. And when I was a student at UVA in the 88 to 90, one of the things we were told is, don't go in Fifield. It's like, and now it is probably the complete opposite, that neighborhood now, which is good in one sense because it is a wonderful neighborhood. It's close to downtown and everything, but that is one of the pluses and minuses of it. So, we just have to factor all of this in and see what's going to be best for the city, for all of our residents as we move forward. So that's all I have to say at this point, because I'm tired. It's been a long day.
Understood.
And just some quick final thoughts. At the Regional Housing Partnership, there was a panel with Arlington participated on where they talked about what they had recently approved. And it was interesting. One of the big differences between them and Charlottesville is in terms of what they were allowing to be built by right on lots. It was more aggressive and more than Charlottesville, but they didn't do anything close to inclusionary zoning requirements, intentionality around affordable housing at 0 to 30% AMI, 30 to 60% AMI. And it was interesting in that conversation how different those approaches were. And kind of one of the takeaways is density was necessary but not sufficient to get to 0 to 30 and 30 to 60% AMI. And that Arlington's approach, again, unlike ours, was much more purely market and supply side focus. And I think a lot of what we've done has been to try to be intentional about that 0 to 30 and 30 to 60% AMI level. And I just hope we don't lose a focus on that. Over half the people who live in our city are at 60% AMI or below. When you're talking about 60% AMI, you're really talking about a family of 2 nurses who work, 2 teachers who work, firefighters, the people who serve us in restaurants, work at UVA, work for our city and serve us. And I just hope we don't lose sight of the fact that our status quo right now isn't working. And one of the risks is, one of the things at the conclusion of the Regional Housing Partnership, the chair of the Regional Housing Partnership, Ned Galloway, in Albemarle remarked on how at the UVA panel discussion, UVA said about their proposal at North Fork, you can't please everybody, and they were just going to build market rate units there. And Chair Galloway's response was he was really taken back by that statement of, you can't please everybody because who is that everybody we're talking about? And in their case, it was the nurses, it was the firefighters, it was the teachers. And I just hope we don't lose sight of that. And it is complex. I share fears in terms of, just getting a 10-story luxury office space or luxury apartment complex that, won't trickle down to benefit affordable housing. But I think it is clear that duplexes, triplexes, allowing affordable housing developers to build affordable housing, like we approved at Park Street in Maca, is critical if this isn't going to become an exclusive community that's only affordable to the rich. And I know we all share that goal, and it's hard to get there, but I just, that's what informs my thinking on it, is what is going to help us accomplish that goal while acknowledging there is a lot of uncertainty. And I think particularly when you're talking about a 10-story, building. There's some questions in terms of, depending on where you build that, is that really going to help? But there are risks that we block development, and it's going to benefit those people who need it. So,
I have some thoughts on where I'm thinking about this. Part of it was the rate of change was a big disappointment for me personally. I know a lot of people were excited because it meant very little change over time, but I was hoping for some change over time to do the things that we say we want to do. But that was before the interest rates shot up and all the prices effectively doubled, which made everything so much worse. So that scared me, and I'm worried about that. And I don't know when that gets fixed. And that's, I guess, ultimately up to the Fed.
Well, one of the questions, a series of questions I had asked was about whether the new economic conditions affect the rate of change that's being suggested. And that's, I think, one of the questions I think Mr. Freeze was going to duck to the consultants.
Well, and a different set of consultants.
Different consultants, yeah. Anyway, 7:58.
Additional discussion? I would also entertain a motion at this time.
I have a motion.
Please state it.
I move that we adjourn, and I would note that we'll leave it to the discretion of the NDS staff whether they wish to include, for Mayor Snook's benefit, that today is actually National Smoke and Mirrors Day.
I'm glad to know that. I'm glad to know that. I would not have known that had I not come here tonight.
Well, at least we've increased your knowledge in one sense.
Hey, second that motion.
I hear a second. Can I see thumbs? I see thumbs. Good night, all. Thank you.
Thank you all.